It was December 1944. The coldest winter Europe had seen in decades, and the war that many believed was nearing its end suddenly took a brutal and unexpected turn. The Allied armies had pushed deep into occupied territory after the Normandy landings. Paris had been liberated, and the world thought Hitler's forces were in full retreat. Yet in the snowy forests of the Ardennes, the German High Command prepared one last desperate gamble, an offensive so bold and so dangerous that it would shock the Allies and nearly tear apart their lines. In the early hours of December 16th, with thick fog hanging low and snow covering the pine trees, German artillery thundered across a 70-mile front. Panzer divisions and seasoned infantry surged forward, punching into American positions and driving deep into Belgium and Luxembourg. Tanks with iron crosses burst through the fog. Soldiers in white camouflage slipped between frozen ridgelines, and soon the Allies realized they were facing the largest battle of the Western Front. Entire divisions were surrounded. Towns like Bastogne became desperate strongholds, and soldiers fought in sub-zero conditions with little food, dwindling ammunition, and the ever-present fear of encirclement. For 6 weeks, the Ardennes became a battlefield of fire and ice, where the courage of the ordinary soldier, the resilience of American defenses, and the sheer determination of Allied commanders would decide the fate of Europe. Hitler's last offensive aimed to split the Allied lines, recapture Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate, but in the end it would become a disaster for Germany and hasten the fall of the Third Reich. Tonight we will relive every moment of this desperate clash, the surprise, the chaos, the heroism, and the cost of the battle that came to be known as the Battle of the Bulge. But before we begin, I want to know, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it right now, as you join us for this story of struggle, sacrifice, and the turning of the tide in the frozen Ardennes. By the winter of 1944, the Third Reich was standing on the edge of collapse, its armies driven back on all fronts. Yet Adolf Hitler prepared one final throw of the dice. The Eastern Front consumed German divisions at a terrifying rate, with the Red Army advancing relentlessly toward the borders of East Prussia. In the west, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and pushed across France into Belgium and the Netherlands. The German Wehrmacht, once unstoppable, now staggered under the weight of relentless assaults and dwindling resources. Yet Hitler refused to accept the inevitability of defeat, clinging instead to the belief that a bold strike could still change the course of war. He saw opportunity not in retreat, but in attack, a gamble to fracture the Allied coalition. His mind turned to the Ardennes, the forested hills of Belgium and Luxembourg that had once served as a gateway for German victories. There, under cover of winter storms, he planned to unleash a counteroffensive of shocking scale. To his generals it was reckless, but to Hitler it was salvation. This was to be Germany's last gamble, one that could either break the Allies or doom the Reich forever. The strategic situation was dire, but Hitler sought to mask desperation with audacity. Germany's industrial cities lay in ruins under Allied bombing, its oil fields captured or destroyed, and its railways shattered by relentless attacks. The Wehrmacht lacked fuel, ammunition, and even food, yet Hitler dreamed of an operation requiring massive reserves of both men and material. He believed that if he could strike a blow deep into the Allied front, he could sever their armies and force a negotiated peace. The chosen target was the Ardennes, a region the Allies had left thinly defended, convinced the dense forests and rugged hills were safe. It was here, Hitler thought, he could recreate the triumph of 1940, when German panzers had cut through the Ardennes and shattered France. He envisioned a thrust to the river Meuse, then on to Antwerp, splitting the British and American armies. Such a victory, he believed, would shake Allied confidence and fracture the coalition. And with the West divided, He hoped to turn fully against the Soviet Union, buying Germany time to survive. The Ardennes offensive was less a plan of reason than of faith, born from Hitler's unyielding will to fight on. The Allies, flush with victories in France and the liberation of Belgium, saw Germany as beaten, its back broken beyond repair. Eisenhower's armies stretched across a wide front, preparing to advance into the Reich itself, with eyes fixed on the Rhine. The Ardennes sector, sparsely populated and heavily forested, was chosen as a quiet area, a place where exhausted divisions could rest. American units stationed there were often understrength, consisting of inexperienced troops and battered veterans recovering from earlier battles. Supplies were plentiful, but the assumption of safety dulled vigilance, leaving defensive lines thin and unprepared. Allied planners saw no possibility of a German counteroffensive of major scale, believing the Reich too weak to mount such a blow. Confidence swelled as Christmas approached, and soldiers dreamed more of going home than of facing another desperate German assault. This complacency would soon prove deadly, for the Wehrmacht was gathering strength in the very forests the Allies overlooked. The silence of the Ardennes was not peace, but the quiet before a storm, and within that storm lay Hitler's last gamble, ready to ignite. Inside the Führer's headquarters at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler outlined his vision with a mixture of defiance and obsession. His generals, men like Gerd von Rundstedt and Walter Model, expressed doubts, warning that Germany lacked the fuel and strength for such an ambitious strike. They favored smaller operations, designed to delay the Allies and preserve dwindling reserves for defense. But Hitler dismissed hesitation as cowardice, demanding boldness in the face of overwhelming odds. He insisted that only a dramatic victory could reverse Germany's fortunes, and anything less would mean certain defeat. The offensive would be named Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, a title chosen to disguise its true purpose. Beneath the deception lay the reality, an all-or-nothing gamble requiring precision, surprise, and absolute faith in the fighting spirit of German soldiers. Orders were issued in strict secrecy, with entire divisions disappearing into forests under cover of night. For Hitler, it was less strategy than destiny, a final chance to defy the world aligned against him. His conviction pressed forward an army that no longer believed in victory, but still obeyed his command. And in that obedience, the seeds of the Ardennes battle were sown. The scale of forces gathered for the offensive shocked even those who doubted its chances. Nearly 200,000 men and over 1,000 tanks and assault guns were moved into position, hidden among the forests and villages of the Ardennes. Units were pulled from across the Reich, some veterans of the Eastern Front, others poorly trained replacements barely prepared for combat. The mighty SS Panzer divisions, such as the 1st SS Leibstandarte and 12th SS Hitlerjugend, formed the spearhead of the attack. Behind them marched Volksgrenadier units, cobbled together from conscripts, older men, and recovering wounded. Supplies were scarce, fuel dangerously low, and yet the offensive relied on speed and surprise to compensate for weakness. The Germans counted on winter storms to ground Allied aircraft, shielding their movements from the skies. Ammunition was rationed carefully, and fuel dumps were stockpiled with the hope of capturing Allied reserves along the way. Every detail of the plan balanced on a knife's edge, where success or failure could hinge on hours. The Ardennes was to be a gamble played with Germany's last reserves, and Hitler staked everything on its outcome. For German soldiers preparing in the snow-covered forests, the offensive carried a mixture of dread and determination. They were told this was to be the strike that would decide the war, the blow that would bring victory or death. Propaganda painted a picture of triumph, but many veterans knew the odds were slim. their resources stretched thin. Still, the memory of earlier victories carried a strange hope, a belief that audacity might yet defeat superior numbers. Soldiers whispered of Antwerp, the great port that symbolized both promise and impossibility. They marched with frostbitten feet, carrying rifles, machine guns, and panzerfausts, hoping the fog and snow would mask their approach. Tanks growled forward under camouflage, their tracks muffled in the frozen earth. To many this was a mission of desperation, but also one of duty, a final test of loyalty to a crumbling Reich. They believed they marched into history, though few knew how brutal the test would become. The Ardennes would prove not salvation, but a crucible of destruction. On the Allied side, few imagined the storm that was about to break. American soldiers decorated Christmas trees in their billets, sang carols, and wrote letters home. Commanders rotated weary divisions into the Ardennes, precisely because it seemed quiet, a place for recovery. Patrols reported occasional skirmishes, but nothing to suggest the gathering of German armies. The frozen forests appeared empty, yet thousands of German troops waited within, silent as shadows. Tanks and artillery were hidden under branches and snow, positioned for the opening barrage. Allied intelligence noted movements, but dismissed them as defensive preparations, failing to see the scale of the threat. Confidence bred carelessness, leaving gaps in communication and weaknesses in defense. To Eisenhower and Bradley, the greatest challenge lay in pushing into Germany, not holding Belgium, but by mid-December, the stage was set for one of the greatest battles of the war. The quiet Christmas of 1944 was about to explode. The Ardennes offensive would begin on December 16th, with a thunder of artillery that shattered the winter silence. Hitler's gamble, crafted in secrecy and desperation, was about to be unleashed upon an unsuspecting enemy. It was not a campaign of measured objectives but of ambition, designed to shock the Allies into crisis. Its very scale made it reckless, yet its surprise made it formidable. In that moment, the hopes of the Reich and the lives of thousands hung in the balance. For Germany, it was a final bid to alter destiny. For the Allies, it would be a brutal test of resilience. The snowbound forests of Belgium were about to become a battlefield of blood and fire. Hitler's last gamble would shape not only the winter of 1944, but the memory of the war itself, and from this desperate strike would emerge one of the most legendary struggles in modern history. The Battle of the Bulge had begun to take form. The Ardennes in December 1944 was a landscape both beautiful and unforgiving, a dense quilt of forests, hills, and narrow valleys blanketed in snow. The pine and fir trees stood like frozen sentinels, their branches sagging under ice, turning the land into a maze of shadows and white silence. Villages were scattered across the region, stone cottages clustered around churches, their chimneys coughing smoke into the bitter air. Winding roads, often little more than frozen tracks, twisted through the hills, their surfaces treacherous with ice and snow. Rivers cut through the valleys, bridges standing as lifelines for movement in terrain, otherwise impassable to armor. To the Allied command, this was a quiet sector, a place unfit for large-scale mechanized warfare. They saw the Ardennes as a natural barrier, a frozen shield against attack, just as it had seemed in 1940 before German panzers broke through. The cold itself seemed to guard the front, for blizzards and fog grounded aircraft and slowed every march. Yet this very environment, which lulled the Allies into complacency, provided the perfect cloak for the enemy. Beneath its silence, the Ardennes was preparing to erupt. The winter of 1944 was among the harshest of the war, a season of biting winds and relentless frost. American soldiers stationed there recalled how the cold seeped into their bones, freezing water canteens and stiffening boots until they cracked. Frostbite became as much an enemy as German bullets, leaving men with blackened fingers and toes. Foxholes dug into the frozen ground were shallow and brittle, their walls crumbling under the weight of ice. Snow muffled every sound, creating an eerie stillness broken only by distant artillery practice or the bark of a sentry's rifle. Helmets frosted over, rifles jammed in the cold, and engines coughed black smoke before sputtering out in the bitter air. The men cursed the weather more than the war, for the enemy seemed far away, beaten back into Germany. They sang Christmas carols, shared cigarettes, and dreamed of warm firesides, convinced the Ardennes was their sanctuary. But winter was more than scenery. It was strategy, shaping movement, masking intentions, and killing as effectively as weapons. For the Germans, it was the ally that would make surprise possible. The Allied High Command regarded the Ardennes as a sector of secondary importance, unworthy of heavy defences. Eisenhower and Bradley allocated their strongest forces to the north and south, where offensives into Germany were expected to meet resistance. The Ardennes was instead assigned divisions in need of rest, battered units recovering from earlier campaigns. Among them were the inexperienced 106th Infantry Division and the weary 28th Infantry Division, both under strength and low on morale. Supplies arrived slowly through narrow roads, with fuel and ammunition rationed at times more by weather than by planning. Command posts were thinly manned, and artillery placements were scattered, with few reserves in immediate reach. The area was considered a place where troops could recuperate and prepare for renewed offensives elsewhere. No one anticipated that the forest was hiding one of the largest concentrations of German armour since the war began. Allied planners believed Germany had no strength left for such boldness. Their complacency left a door open where they imagined there was only a wall. Intelligence, which had served the Allies well throughout the campaign, faltered here. Reports of German movements trickled in, but they were dismissed as defensive maneuvers or the shuffling of exhausted troops. Reconnaissance flights were hindered by storms, and the winter fog cloaked roads and railways from the eyes in the sky. Prisoner interrogations revealed hints of a coming operation, but analysts considered them exaggerations from desperate men. Some Allied officers raised alarms, noting unusual radio silence from German units, yet their concerns were lost in the optimism of approaching victory. Allied leaders saw Germany as a beaten power, incapable of mounting an offensive on the scale of Normandy. The focus remained on pushing toward the Rhine and preparing for the final blow into the Reich. The Ardennes was not studied with suspicion, but glanced at with indifference, and in that indifference lay the seeds of surprise. The silence of the forest was not emptiness, but concealment. For the German planners, the Ardennes was both obstacle and opportunity. The terrain that seemed to the Allies an impossible route for tanks had once been the very key to German conquest. In May 1940, German panzers had thundered through these forests, smashing French defences and toppling the old order of Europe. Hitler, clinging to past triumphs, believed the forest would again deliver victory through surprise. The narrow roads and bottlenecks would make movement difficult, but if seized quickly, they could funnel armoured columns deep into Belgium. Snow and fog would ground Allied aircraft, shielding columns from the skies that otherwise dominated the battlefield. Villages could serve as staging points, their roads leading toward the Meuse and, beyond it, Antwerp. The Ardennes was treacherous, but in its treachery lay the chance for audacity. Where the Allies saw rest, the Germans saw a battlefield waiting to awaken. The quiet hills would once again echo with the roar of engines and the crash of artillery. Among the American troops stationed there, life carried on with a deceptive calm. Soldiers lit fires in ruined barns, brewed coffee over tin cups, and trudged through snow on routine patrols. Many had never seen major combat, their uniforms still crisp, their weapons hardly tested in the chaos of war. Officers used the sector to train replacements, drilling them in the basics of foxhole defense and patrol tactics. Letters from home arrived regularly, and the promise of Christmas lifted spirits in the frigid air. Villagers greeted the Americans with warmth, offering shelter and bread despite their own hardships. To many soldiers, the war felt distant, the Ardennes little more than a winter outpost on the road to Germany. They joked that their greatest enemy was boredom, punctuated only by the occasional shellfire or ambush. But beneath the snow, German armies lay hidden, waiting to strike. The calm was not safety, it was the calm before a storm. The German build-up was executed with extraordinary secrecy, a feat made possible by the very terrain the Allies dismissed. Divisions moved under cover of night, their convoys disguised or camouflaged beneath dense forests. Local civilians were kept in the dark, their villages avoided or monitored to prevent word from spreading. Fuel dumps and ammunition caches were hidden in barns, fields, and caves, prepared for the offensive's opening moves. Soldiers marched quietly through the woods, their tracks covered by snow or erased by patrols following behind. Commanders enforced strict radio silence, ensuring that Allied intelligence detected nothing unusual. The storm of men and machines gathering in the forest was masked by nature itself, hidden behind fog and frost. Entire panzer divisions crouched like predators, waiting to spring, unseen and unsuspected by their prey. The Ardennes, once a resting ground, had become a killing ground in preparation. The silence was not ignorance, it was design. On the eve of the offensive, the Ardennes remained deceptively still, its forests frozen under the weight of winter. American soldiers huddled in their foxholes, unaware that thousands of German troops stood just miles away. The snow fell gently, covering tank tracks, erasing footprints, and deepening the illusion of emptiness. Fires flickered in village windows, families whispering prayers for peace as armies closed around them. Officers made their rounds, speaking of routine and rotation, never of the possibility of attack. Yet every hour the German timetable ticked closer, and the quiet was about to shatter. The Ardennes was no longer a quiet front, but the stage for one of the greatest battles of the war. In its woods and valleys, destiny was crouched, waiting for dawn. The Allies believed they were safe, but safety had become their greatest illusion. The storm was gathering, and soon it would break. In the summer of 1944, as German armies reeled from defeats in Normandy and the Eastern Front, Hitler began to shape a vision, both audacious and desperate. He refused to accept that Germany was on the defensive, instead searching for one stroke of genius that could turn disaster into opportunity. In his mind, war was never truly lost until the will to resist had been extinguished. That will, he believed, remained unbroken, so long as he could inspire Germany with a bold offensive. He studied the map, his eyes drawn again and again to the Ardennes, where he had triumphed in 1940. The forests, hills, and narrow roads seemed to invite surprise, offering concealment for tanks and soldiers alike. The Allies had grown complacent, leaving the sector lightly held, convinced no great danger could come from it. To Hitler, this made it the perfect stage for a reversal of fortunes. He envisioned an operation that would crash through the Ardennes and split the Allied armies in two. That vision became Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine. The goals of the operation were staggering in their ambition, almost fantastical in their scope. German armies would drive through the Ardennes with 3 panzer armies, smash across the river Meuse, and capture Antwerp. By seizing the port, Hitler hoped to choke off Allied supply lines and drive a wedge between the American and British forces. Such a blow, he believed, would shatter the Allied coalition, forcing the Western powers to negotiate peace. If Britain and America could be neutralized, Germany could then turn its full fury against the Soviet Union. This was no small counterattack. It was a grand vision of a second miracle like 1940, designed to alter the entire trajectory of the war. To achieve it, Hitler demanded secrecy, speed, and total commitment from his armies. His staff drew up timetables, counting on snow and fog to mask German movements from Allied air power. In Hitler's eyes, this was not desperation, but destiny. He believed that even in defeat, Germany could still seize victory by sheer will. German generals, however, saw reality more clearly, and their doubts were deep. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the Oberbefehlshaber West, warned that Germany no longer possessed the strength for such a daring strike. Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, argued for a smaller offensive, one that might delay the Allies but not attempt to break them. They pointed out shortages of fuel, the lack of reserves, and the worn state of the panzer divisions after years of attrition. Many remembered the catastrophe of Kursk, where an ambitious offensive had bled the German army white. But Hitler brushed aside their objections, accusing them of lacking vision and courage. He told his staff that only a bold attack could restore German morale and undermine Allied unity. Compromise, in his mind, was weakness, and weakness meant defeat. Thus their protests were silenced under the weight of Hitler's authority. The generals prepared reluctantly, driven less by belief than by obedience. Secrecy became the cornerstone of Wacht am Rhein, and it was enforced with ruthless precision. Orders were delivered verbally whenever possible, avoiding written records that might leak to enemy hands. Troop movements took place under cover of darkness, with camouflage and deception used to mask entire divisions. Radio silence was strictly enforced, creating an eerie quiet as formations vanished into the forests. Civilians in occupied villages were monitored or removed, ensuring no rumors could slip across Allied lines. To the Allies, it appeared as if the Germans were digging in for defense, not gathering for attack. Fuel and ammunition were hidden in barns, caves, and sheds, prepared in advance for the first days of battle. Divisions were shuffled and renamed, creating the illusion of weakness where there was strength. By mid-December, the deception was nearly complete. An army of nearly 500,000 men crouched silently in the Ardennes, undetected and unanticipated. The composition of the attacking force was formidable on paper, though fragile in reality. Hitler assembled 3 armies for the offensive: the 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich, the 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel, and the 7th Army under Erich Brandenberger. At their core were elite SS divisions such as the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, seasoned panzer units like the 2nd and 9th Panzer Divisions, and infantry formations renamed as Volksgrenadiers. These units carried names of strength, but many were understrength, filled with raw recruits, convalescents, and men pulled from Luftwaffe or Kriegsmarine surplus. Equipment varied wildly, with modern Panthers standing beside aging Panzer IVs and captured French vehicles. Ammunition and fuel were rationed so carefully that success depended on capturing Allied supplies along the way. Yet in Hitler's mind, these divisions represented a reborn fist of steel, capable of smashing through American lines. Numbers mattered less than willpower, he declared, and in his will, he demanded their obedience to his vision. The offensive's timetable was brutally precise, for speed was essential to success. Within 24 hours, German forces were expected to break through the American front lines and reach the Meuse River. Within 72 hours, armored spearheads were to be at Antwerp, severing the Allies' logistical lifeline. Every hour mattered. Every delay risked failure. The plan left no margin for setbacks, assuming the enemy would be too stunned to react effectively, but the generals knew from experience that war rarely followed timetables. Roads in the Ardennes were narrow and easily clogged, and winter conditions could turn them into frozen traps. Fuel convoys risked falling behind, while artillery movements could stall in icy mud. Hitler ignored such concerns, insisting that sheer audacity would compensate for logistical obstacles. To him, hesitation was worse than defeat. The offensive was designed to succeed through shock, not prudence. Despite the doubts, many German officers executed their preparations with grim determination. They remembered the victories of earlier years, when surprise and speed had carried the day against stronger enemies. Some believed that perhaps one last miracle was possible, that the Allies had grown overconfident and vulnerable. Tank commanders studied maps by lantern light, tracing routes through villages and valleys. Infantry officers drilled their men in silence, warning them that the first days would decide everything. Artillery crews oiled their guns and stockpiled shells, knowing the barrage would be massive but short-lived. The men themselves, drawn from across Germany, spoke of Antwerp with a mixture of dread and hope. They carried weapons that were often mismatched, but their orders were clear: push forward, no matter the cost. The atmosphere was tense, filled with both anticipation and resignation. For many, it was less a campaign of glory than a march into fate. Thus, Operation Wacht am Rhein took shape. Forged in secrecy and desperation, it was a plan born from Hitler's defiance, sustained by the obedience of generals who no longer believed, and executed by soldiers who bore the weight of duty. Its brilliance lay in surprise, its weakness in ambition beyond Germany's means. Yet on the eve of battle, the Reich's hopes were tied to it, as if victory in the Ardennes might erase defeat elsewhere. The forests of Belgium and Luxembourg became a stage where history's course would be contested once more. Hitler saw destiny, his generals saw disaster, but still the armies gathered, their engines silent, their guns waiting. The world believed Germany beaten, yet Germany prepared to strike. In the snowbound stillness, the Ardennes waited to become legend. The storm had been planned, and soon it would break. By December 1944, the Allied command in the West was riding a wave of confidence, convinced the end of the war was in sight. Paris had been liberated in August, Antwerp captured in September, and German forces pushed back across much of France and Belgium. Eisenhower saw the campaign as entering its final phase, with only the Rhine River standing between his armies and the heart of Germany. Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group stretched across the center of the front, while Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group held the north. The U.S. 1st, 3rd, and 9th Armies pressed along a broad front, keeping constant pressure on the retreating Wehrmacht. Despite setbacks at supply lines and fierce resistance in places like the Hütgen forest, the Allies believed the Germans had exhausted their ability to strike back. In high command meetings, discussions centered on when, not if, the Reich would collapse. Few voices warned of danger lurking in the Ardennes. Instead, it was seen as the perfect place to rest battle-worn divisions, and in that assumption lay a fatal blind spot. The Ardennes had a reputation among planners as difficult terrain for large-scale operations, a region where forests and hills restricted movement. Thick pine woods, narrow valleys and winding roads seemed to make tank maneuvers almost impossible. During the autumn, heavy rains had turned trails to mud, while winter froze them into icy tracks barely wide enough for convoys. Villages were small and scattered, their roads offering little capacity for rapid troop movement. To the Allies, this made the sector secure, since they assumed the Germans could not mass forces there undetected. American staff officers argued that if the enemy attacked at all, It would be along the more open plains to the north or south. The Ardennes was therefore lightly garrisoned, defended by units considered either too inexperienced or too worn down for more dangerous sectors. Bradley called it a quiet front, a place to recover before the final thrust into Germany. No one imagined that beneath the stillness of the snowbound hills, an army was assembling. Confidence had transformed into complacency, and complacency into vulnerability. The divisions assigned to the Ardennes reflected this mindset of relaxation rather than readiness. The 106th Infantry Division, fresh from the United States, arrived with little combat experience and was placed directly into the line. The 28th Infantry Division, bloodied and battered from the Hurtgen Forest, was rotated into the area to rest and refit. The 4th Infantry Division also took positions there, recovering from earlier campaigns while integrating replacements into its ranks. These units were spread thin, covering long stretches of forest, with few reserves in depth. Artillery support was limited, with guns scattered and ammunition stocks modest. Tank destroyer battalions were present, but their crews often lacked the experience to counter a major armoured assault. Even the 9th Armoured Division, tasked with watching key roads, was under strength and largely untested. For these men, the Ardennes seemed more like a training ground than a battlefield. They built fires, decorated trees for Christmas, and wrote letters home. In their minds, the war had shifted elsewhere, leaving them in relative safety. At the highest levels of command, Eisenhower and Bradley were focused not on defense, but on preparing for the final advance into Germany. The capture of the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, was the next great objective, and all planning revolved around breaking the Rhine River line. Logistics dominated the conversation, as Allied armies struggled with supply shortages after outrunning their depots during the rapid pursuit across France. Antwerp had been captured, but its approaches were not yet fully secured, leaving supplies to flow through distant ports. Eisenhower's broad front strategy demanded resources for multiple thrusts at once, stretching men and materials thin. The Ardennes was therefore neglected, considered unimportant in the grand scheme of operations. To Eisenhower, it was a backwater. To Bradley, it was a place to rest divisions before the main assault. Neither man imagined that Hitler had chosen this very sector as the focal point of his last gamble. Their eyes were fixed on the Rhine, not the Ardennes, and that miscalculation would soon cost them dearly. American intelligence in the region did little to challenge this complacency. Reconnaissance flights struggled with poor weather, often grounded by fog and snowstorms that blanketed the Ardennes. Reports of German troop movements were either ignored or explained away as defensive preparations. Interrogations of prisoners revealed hints of something larger, but these were dismissed as fabrications or exaggerations. Analysts believed the German army was in no condition to mount a major offensive, citing shortages of fuel, manpower, and equipment. Ultra-intercepts, so valuable throughout the campaign, picked up little activity thanks to strict German radio silence. As a result, the Ardennes seemed to confirm the intelligence picture, a quiet front guarded only by fragments of beaten German divisions. What the Allies missed was the scale of secrecy achieved by Hitler's planners, who had hidden 500,000 men in the forests. The silence was not proof of weakness but the camouflage of strength, and when the blow came, it would catch the Allies almost entirely unprepared. The soldiers stationed in the Ardennes embodied this false sense of calm. In villages like St. Vith, Clairvaux, and Wiltz, Americans shared meals with civilians, traded chocolate and cigarettes, and enjoyed brief moments of peace. Many decorated Christmas trees in their billets, strung lights, and played phonograph records of Bing Crosby singing "I'll Be Home for Christmas." Patrols were limited, and the greatest challenge seemed to be enduring the bitter cold and endless boredom. Letters from home brought cheer, reminding the men that the war was nearing its end. The occasional artillery exchange or skirmish with German patrols was seen as little more than harassment. Veterans from Italy or Normandy told new recruits they were lucky to be in such a safe sector. The forest felt alive with snow and silence, not with the threat of imminent destruction. For the men in uniform, the Ardennes was a pause, not a prelude, but history was already moving against them. Bradley, a commander known for his calm and pragmatic style, reinforced the notion that the Ardennes posed no great threat. He described it as a quiet zone, ideal for giving his divisions much-needed rest after months of grinding battles. His headquarters focused on offensive operations elsewhere, leaving the sector with minimal oversight. Corps and divisional commanders mirrored this attitude, devoting attention to training and recuperation rather than fortification. There were few strong defensive lines, little in the way of prepared positions, and almost no reserves close at hand. Supply depots were modest, assuming that demand would remain light. Engineers built roads and maintained bridges, but no one planned for the mass of armor that would soon roll through. The Ardennes, in Allied eyes, was an afterthought, yet it was precisely this neglect that made it so appealing to Hitler. In their complacency, the Allies had left open a door to disaster, and through that door, the German army was already preparing to march. Thus, by mid-December 1944, the stage was set for catastrophe born not of weakness, but of overconfidence. The Allies believed they were on the brink of victory, that Germany's days were numbered, and that the Ardennes was safe. Eisenhower trusted in his broad front advance. Bradley trusted in the notion of a quiet sector. Soldiers trusted in their commanders, and civilians trusted in the Allied presence. Yet trust was not enough, for the forest itself concealed a storm of men and machines. Behind the curtain of snow, the Wehrmacht was poised to unleash its last desperate offensive. The Allies, blinded by their own success, never saw it coming. Confidence had become their greatest vulnerability, and complacency had written the opening lines of the Ardennes tragedy. The quiet before the storm was ending, and soon the storm itself would roar. At 5:30 in the morning, on December 16, 1944, the stillness of the Ardennes was torn apart by the roar of thousands of German guns. In a thunderous instant, the illusion of quiet vanished as artillery shells screamed through the dark, exploding across American positions. Forests that had seemed peaceful just hours before now shook with the violence of fire and steel. Trees shattered, earth erupted, and snow turned to mud under the relentless bombardment. It was not one battery or one corps, but more than 1,600 artillery pieces massed along a 70-mile front. The scale of firepower rivaled the greatest barrages of the Eastern Front, calculated to paralyze the enemy before they could respond. American foxholes, shallow and fragile in the frozen ground, offered little protection against the rain of shrapnel. Communications lines were cut within minutes, leaving units blind and isolated. The night had ended in sudden chaos, as the German offensive announced itself with overwhelming fury. For the men who survived that first blast, it felt like the very earth had turned against them. The Germans had meticulously planned the opening strike to achieve maximum shock and confusion. Each sector was targeted with precision, designed to break American lines of communication and disrupt command posts. Bridges and crossroads were zeroed in by heavy batteries, cutting off vital arteries of movement. Infantry trenches and artillery emplacements were plastered with high explosives, leaving stunned defenders unable to organize. Even rear areas thought to be safe were hammered, as German gunners sought to create panic far behind the front. Shells screamed overhead in an unending chorus, punctuated by the crash of mortars and the thud of Nebelwerfer rockets. These screaming memes, as the Americans called them, filled the forest with an unearthly howl before crashing into the earth. The effect was both physical and psychological, shaking men's courage as much as their positions. Soldiers clung to the ground, praying for survival as dirt and snow rained down upon them. For 30 minutes the Ardennes became a cauldron of fire and noise, a prelude to the storm about to follow. American units caught in the barrage were a mixture of inexperienced and exhausted divisions, ill-prepared for such an onslaught. The 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived from the United States, found its positions in the Schnee Eifel Mountains pounded without mercy. Men who had never faced combat were suddenly buried under earth, their foxholes collapsing as shells detonated nearby. Radios went dead, wires were severed, and company commanders could not reach their battalions. The 28th Infantry Division, already battered from the Hürtgen forest, endured yet another hammering that tested the limits of its endurance. Veterans cursed the heavens, realizing at once that this was no minor skirmish, but something immense. In villages along the line, artillery shells tore apart houses where soldiers had been quartered, sending stone and timber flying through the air. Civilians huddled in cellars, trembling as the ground shook with each explosion. Entire sectors of the front fell silent, not from order but from devastation. In that silence, German infantry began to move forward, shadowed by tanks. The opening act of the Ardennes offensive had begun. The terrain itself magnified the terror of the bombardment. The Ardennes forests, thick with fir trees, trapped shrapnel and wood splinters, turning each explosion into a storm of deadly fragments. Snow absorbed the blast waves, but also sent shards of ice flying into the faces of soldiers crouched in cover. Valleys echoed with the thunder of guns, amplifying the sense of being surrounded by destruction on all sides. Roads were cratered, bridges damaged, and supply dumps set ablaze in the first minutes. Truck convoys attempting to move were caught in the maelstrom, their vehicles shattered and burning. The smoke mingled with morning fog, cloaking the battlefield in a choking haze. Amid this confusion, messages failed to reach higher headquarters, leaving commanders to guess at the scale of the attack. Some believed it was only a localized counterstroke, not realizing the offensive stretched across the entire front. In truth, the barrage was the curtain raiser for the largest battle the US Army would ever fight in Europe, and already the cost in lives was mounting. In many positions, men were paralyzed by fear, while in others they fought to hold the line despite the overwhelming fire. Officers tried to rally their companies, shouting orders through the roar of explosions, but often their voices were lost in the chaos. Medics scrambled through the snow, dragging the wounded to makeshift shelters under constant shellfire. Some units fired back blindly, their mortars and machine guns cracking defiantly even as their positions were shredded. Yet the sheer scale of the German attack made resistance almost symbolic in those first hours. The sound of tank engines soon mingled with the thunder of guns, signaling the advance of panzer divisions. For the Americans, the nightmare was just beginning, as waves of infantry followed the barrage into the shattered front lines. German soldiers, hardened and grim, emerged from the forests like phantoms of war. Their rifles and machine guns spat fire as they pushed toward villages and crossroads. The artillery had done its work. Now the assault would finish it. Behind the bombardment, German commanders unleashed their carefully prepared infantry and armored units. Volksgrenadier divisions moved first, infiltrating through the forests, bypassing strongpoints, and cutting communications further. Their task was to open the way for the armoured spearheads that followed behind, panzer divisions, with Panthers and Panzer IVs at the front, rumbled forward on narrow forest roads. Bridges groaned under the weight of steel tracks, while engineers worked furiously to clear obstacles. Assault guns and half-tracks carried men into the chaos, ready to exploit the disarray left by the bombardment. The Americans, dazed and uncoordinated, found their outposts overwhelmed one after another. Platoons cut off in the woods fought until ammunition was gone, then were captured or killed. German momentum grew with each passing hour, powered by both surprise and preparation. The Ardennes was no longer quiet. It was a battlefield drenched in fire. For individual American soldiers, the experience was one of sudden terror and disbelief. Men who had been writing letters home by candlelight were buried alive in collapsed dugouts. Those walking patrols found themselves caught in a storm of fire, cut down before they could react. In frozen villages, soldiers awoke to the sound of windows shattering, walls collapsing, and the earth trembling beneath their feet. Some ran for the woods, only to be caught by falling shells that turned trees into splintered spears. Others clutched their rifles, staring into the smoke-filled distance, trying to glimpse the enemy behind the barrage. Fear coursed through the lines, but so too did moments of courage, as small groups clung to their posts and returned fire. Each man's survival seemed like a miracle, and each casualty a brutal reminder of how fragile safety was. The Ardennes, which had seemed so quiet and calm, was transformed into hell in an instant, and the men knew instinctively that this was only the beginning. The storm had arrived, and it showed no mercy. As the sun rose over the snow-covered hills, the scale of the disaster became clearer, but still not fully understood. Communications were shattered, frontline units in chaos, and higher headquarters only faintly aware of the scope of the German assault. Eisenhower and Bradley, miles away, received fragmentary reports that hinted at a major offensive, but disbelief lingered. Many commanders assumed it was a diversion, a desperate thrust rather than a full-scale campaign. Yet for the men on the ground, there was no doubt the Ardennes had exploded into war. Villages burned, forests shuddered, and the snow was stained red with blood. The German gamble had been unleashed with ferocity, and the Americans were caught unprepared. The opening barrage had shattered the calm, setting the tone for what was to come. The Battle of the Bulge had begun not with whispers, but with thunder, and that thunder would echo for weeks across the frozen forests of Belgium. The German assault that followed the artillery barrage struck with the precision of a hammer blow, designed to shatter the thin American lines. Out of the forests and valleys came columns of panzers, their engines growling like predators released from a cage. Panthers and Panzer IVs led the way, their long-barreled guns scanning for targets as they pushed down icy roads. Behind them came half-tracks filled with infantry, eager to exploit every gap opened by the bombardment. Villages that had been quiet outposts at dawn suddenly became battlegrounds as German tanks crashed through streets. American outposts, manned by squads of inexperienced or exhausted men, found themselves facing overwhelming force. Communications were broken, reserves far away, and the enemy advancing with terrifying speed. The quiet rest sector was dissolving into chaos with each passing minute. Smoke and snow mixed into a curtain of confusion, blinding defenders as their positions crumbled. The breakthrough had begun, and it was merciless. At the northern edge of the assault, the 6th SS Panzer Army, under Sepp Dietrich, drove against the weakest American defenses. Here, the 99th and 106th Infantry Divisions held extended lines across the Schnee Eifel. Their companies stretched too thin to resist concentrated armor. German infantry poured into the woods, bypassing bunkers and cutting telephone wires to isolate defenders. Machine guns raked American foxholes, grenades tumbled into dugouts, and flamethrowers spewed fire against frozen log shelters. Tanks ground forward through minefields, their crews confident that resistance would collapse under sheer weight of steel. For many young American soldiers, it was their first battle, and it came with overwhelming shock. Some fought desperately until ammunition was gone, while others surrendered, dazed by the scale of the assault. In hours, entire regiments were swallowed by the advancing tide, unable to regroup or counterattack. The Ardennes, once considered safe, had become a graveyard of illusions. German momentum was building, and the Americans were falling back in disarray. Further south, General Hasso von Manteufel's 5th Panzer Army struck with surgical precision, driving into the seams of the American front. Manteufel, a seasoned tactician, had drilled his commanders to infiltrate and outmaneuver, not simply bludgeon their way forward. Volksgrenadiers slipped through forests in small groups, bypassing strong points to surround and isolate them. Artillery shifted forward, blanketing crossroads and bridges to block reinforcements from reaching the front. Panthers and assault guns advanced in waves, seizing key villages and clearing paths for follow-on forces. American defenders, caught between encirclement and retreat, fought bitterly but with dwindling chances. At Clairvaux, units of the 110th Infantry Regiment made a stand, holding German armor for nearly 2 days. But everywhere else, the tide was unstoppable, pushing deeper toward the Meuse River. The Germans had cracked the line, and now they surged through it. For Manteufel's divisions, the opening moves had succeeded beyond expectation. The 7th Army under Brandenberger supported the southern flank, advancing against thinly held positions near Luxembourg. Though less powerful than the panzer armies, it tied down American forces that might otherwise have reinforced the north. Small towns like Echternach and Diekirch saw sudden bursts of combat as Volksgrenadiers stormed in with rifles and machine guns blazing. American units fought stubbornly, but without armor or artillery, they were forced into retreat. The 7th Army's advance was slower, but it was part of the larger design, securing the southern hinge of the offensive. Every mile gained widened the gap for the panzer thrusts further north, and every American retreat deepened the sense of disorientation across the front. The German assault was no small probe. It was a full-scale offensive on a scale few had imagined. By nightfall, the map of the Ardennes looked entirely different from the day before. The German gamble was already reshaping the battlefield. For the American soldiers on the ground, the breakthrough was experienced as shock, confusion, and raw survival. Platoons found themselves cut off, unable to contact their battalion headquarters or even neighboring companies. Roads were choked with retreating vehicles, wounded men, and scattered equipment abandoned in haste. Tanks appeared suddenly through the fog, firing point-blank into buildings where GIs had taken cover. Ammunition ran low, food was scarce, and the cold gnawed at every breath. Some units resisted fiercely, holding crossroads and bridges against overwhelming odds. Others melted away, overwhelmed by exhaustion and the realization that they faced entire German armies. Young soldiers, fresh from training camps, were learning in a single day what combat truly meant. Veterans recognized the scale of the attack immediately, muttering that this was no patrol, this was the whole German army. For both, survival became the only strategy as the front collapsed around them. Civilians, too, were caught in the maelstrom, trapped in villages that became battlegrounds overnight. Families huddled in cellars as tanks rumbled overhead, their homes shattered by artillery and gunfire. Farmers saw their livestock scattered or slaughtered, their fields churned by tracks and explosions. Some tried to flee, carrying children through snow, only to stumble into firefights erupting on village streets. Others were forced to stay, silent witnesses to the violence that consumed their towns. In places like St. Vith, Bastogne, and Hoffelise, ordinary Belgians once again saw their homes swallowed by war. The Ardennes, already scarred from 1940, was enduring its second invasion in 4 years. For civilians, there was no strategy or grand plan, only survival amid the storm. Their suffering was a hidden chapter of the battle, overshadowed by the clash of armies, but no less real. War once again had come to their doorsteps uninvited. German success on the first day stunned even their own commanders, who had expected resistance to be stronger. By nightfall on December 16th, armoured columns were pushing deeper than planned, capturing crossroads and forcing American units into retreat. Hitler's gamble seemed, for the moment, to be paying off with breathtaking momentum. Yet cracks were already visible beneath the surface of victory. Fuel shortages slowed tank units, forcing them to halt while engineers searched desperately for captured Allied depots. Some roads became clogged with traffic jams of tanks, trucks, and horse-drawn wagons, delaying the timetable. American units, though battered, were not entirely broken, and some pockets held firm against overwhelming pressure. Still, the breakthrough was undeniable, and panic spread through the ranks of inexperienced divisions. To the Germans it seemed the offensive was opening as planned. To the Americans it was a nightmare realized in a single day. The Ardennes had become the epicenter of a battle that would shape the war's outcome. The first day of the German assault ended with the front lines redrawn, American divisions shattered, and the initiative firmly in German hands. The Ardennes, once a quiet sector, was now alive with the roar of engines and the clash of battle. American high command struggled to comprehend the scale of the breakthrough, unsure whether it was a diversion or the main thrust. Soldiers on the ground had no such doubts, for they had seen entire battalions swallowed in hours. German momentum was strong, but the Allied spirit, though shaken, was not yet broken. Across the snow-covered forests, small groups of GIs prepared to resist with whatever they had left. The Germans had struck with fury, but their victory was only partial, for the deeper challenge lay ahead. Could they sustain their offensive and reach the Meuse before the Allies recovered? That question remained unanswered as night fell on December 16th. The initial breakthrough had been achieved, but the battle was only beginning. Amid the snow-covered forests and rolling hills of the Ardennes stood Bastogne, a modest Belgian town that would soon become the beating heart of the battle. On a map, it appeared unremarkable, a cluster of streets and stone buildings surrounded by farmland and woods. Yet Bastogne's importance lay not in its size but in its geography. The 7 major roads converged there like the spokes of a wheel. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the movement of armies across central Belgium. German planners knew that without it, their panzer columns could not fan out toward the Meuse or secure their flanks. Allied commanders recognized that holding it was essential to slowing the German advance and protecting the rear of retreating units. For the civilians of Bastogne, the war had come before in 1940, but this time it would come harder and linger longer. In December 1944, the town became both a prize and a fortress, a crossroads of fate in the heart of the Ardennes. Its name would be forever etched into history because of the battle soon to unfold there. As German spearheads surged westward, Bastogne loomed as their critical objective, the gateway to Antwerp and beyond. The 5th Panzer Army, under Hasso von Manteuffel, aimed its armoured divisions toward the town with relentless urgency. Panthers and Panzer IVs pushed through villages and forests, their tracks grinding frozen roads into mud and ice. Volksgrenadiers marched in their wake, tasked with clearing resistance and securing flanks. German commanders understood that without Bastogne, their timetable would falter, their armored thrusts vulnerable to counterattack. For them it was not optional, it was indispensable. Hitler himself emphasized its capture, pressing his generals to drive forward regardless of losses. Every mile gained brought them closer to the prize, but every delay gave the Allies precious time to react. The clash over Bastogne was not yet decided, but already it was inevitable. The town had become the crossroads of the German gamble itself. American commanders, recognizing the threat, moved quickly to reinforce Bastogne before it could be swallowed by the German advance. Omar Bradley, shocked by the scale of the offensive, redirected elements of the U.S. Third Army under George Patton northward. Patton, known for his speed and aggression, understood instantly that Bastogne was the key to holding the line. Units of the 101st Airborne Division, veterans of Normandy and Holland, were rushed by truck toward the town. These paratroopers, though weary from previous battles, would soon become the backbone of Bastogne's defense. Alongside them came elements of the 10th Armored Division, their tanks positioned at road junctions to stall the enemy. Engineers built barricades, infantry dug foxholes, and artillery rolled into position despite freezing conditions. Supplies were limited, but determination was not, for the Americans knew Bastogne must not fall. Civilians watched anxiously as soldiers poured into the town, their presence both reassuring and foreboding. The stage was set for a siege that would test the limits of human endurance. The terrain around Bastogne played a decisive role in shaping the battle. Rolling hills and thick woods surrounded the town, providing cover for advancing German troops, but also obstacles that slowed their armor. The snow, falling in heavy sheets, turned open fields into frozen traps, bogging down vehicles and exhausting infantry. Narrow country roads, often clogged with retreating American units, became choke points where every skirmish could delay entire columns. For defenders, the terrain offered opportunities to ambush tanks and funnel attackers into deadly kill zones. Artillery, positioned on higher ground, could rain shells upon advancing formations from relative safety. Yet the same terrain made resupply perilous, with convoys forced to risk ambush and bombardment at every turn. The weather grounded Allied aircraft, denying defenders the air superiority they normally enjoyed. Both sides understood that whoever adapted best to the Ardennes winter would hold the advantage. For Bastogne, geography was both shield and trap, shaping every decision and every sacrifice. Inside Bastogne, tension grew as word spread of German advances tightening around the town. Soldiers fortified buildings, turning houses into strongpoints and streets into defensive lines. Barbed wire, mines, and makeshift barricades transformed the town into a fortress of determination. Civilians caught in the maelstrom, sheltered in cellars, their lives once again disrupted by the brutality of war. Some aided the Americans, offering food, water, or shelter, while others simply prayed for survival. Supplies, however, remained dangerously low, as fuel and ammunition trickled in too slowly for comfort. Medical facilities were strained, with wounded soldiers filling basements and churches converted into field hospitals. The townspeople heard the distant rumble of artillery, a reminder that the storm was drawing closer. Every hour brought reports of villages falling, roads blocked, and enemy armor pressing forward. Bastogne was no longer a quiet crossroads. It was the eye of a growing hurricane. German columns pushed relentlessly toward Bastogne, determined to seize it before the Americans could fully organize their defense. Panzers smashed through outlying villages, their guns silencing resistance with brutal efficiency. Volksgrenadiers advanced through forests, cutting communications and encircling American positions. Yet the resistance was stronger than expected, with small US units delaying progress at every crossroad and bridge. Tank destroyers ambushed convoys, artillery shelled assembly areas, and infantry clung to their posts despite overwhelming odds. These delaying actions bought precious time for reinforcements to reach Bastogne, frustrating German commanders. Fuel shortages compounded their problems, forcing tanks to halt while searching for captured Allied depots. The longer Bastogne held, the more the German timetable unraveled. What Hitler had envisioned as a swift capture became a grueling struggle. The crossroads town was proving more stubborn than the planners had imagined. By December 19th, German forces had encircled Bastogne, isolating the defenders from the outside world. The Americans within the town, roughly 11,000 paratroopers, tankers, and infantry, were cut off on all sides. The siege had begun, and with it a test of willpower unlike anything the 101st Airborne had faced before. Supplies dwindled quickly, forcing rations to be cut and ammunition to be conserved. Medical shortages grew desperate, with doctors operating without anesthetic and bandages reused again and again. Morale, however, remained unbroken, sustained by the knowledge that their stand was vital to the entire Allied front. German commanders, frustrated by delays, intensified their assaults, bombarding the town day and night. But the Americans dug in deeper, turning every street corner into a battlefield. Bastogne had become the hinge on which the entire Ardennes offensive swung, and both sides understood that its fate would shape the outcome of the battle. For the Allies, Bastogne was more than a town. It was a symbol of resistance against the German tide. Eisenhower recognized its importance immediately, declaring that the defense of Bastogne was critical to blunting Hitler's offensive. Patton, driving his Third Army north, vowed to relieve the siege no matter the cost. For the Germans, its capture became an obsession, a goal that consumed men, tanks, and precious fuel. Civilians within the town bore silent witness, trapped between two armies, their lives intertwined with history. Snow continued to fall, covering the wounded and the dead alike, masking the scars of battle under a white shroud. But beneath that snow, the fight for Bastogne raged with unrelenting ferocity. It was no longer just a crossroads. It was the heart of the Ardennes, the point where victory or defeat might be decided. And as the siege tightened, the town became a legend in the making. Bastogne was in the crosshairs, and the world would remember its stand. By December 20th, 1944, Bastogne was fully encircled, a small fortress town surrounded on all sides by advancing German armies. The 101st Airborne Division, supported by elements of the 10th Armored Division and scattered units of infantry and artillery, now found themselves trapped within its frozen streets. Roughly 11,000 men held the perimeter against nearly 4 times their number, facing panzer divisions that had swept across Belgium with frightening speed. Supplies were already low, and the winter weather showed no mercy, blanketing foxholes and turning every movement into an ordeal. Ammunition was rationed with care, fuel was dwindling, and food became scarcer with each passing day. Civilians caught within the town, huddled in cellars and barns, their lives entwined with the fate of the defenders. The Germans tightened their grip, cutting off all roads and shelling the town with artillery, day and night. Bastogne was now an island in a sea of enemy forces, isolated yet defiant. For the Americans inside, retreat was impossible, surrender unthinkable, and survival uncertain. The siege had begun, and with it one of the most legendary defenses of the war. The perimeter around Bastogne was thin, fragile, and constantly tested by German probes. Each road leading into the town became a lifeline and a battlefield, guarded by small groups of paratroopers and tank crews. In places like Neuville, Foy, and Marvy, clashes erupted as German infantry and armor pushed forward, only to be repelled by determined resistance. Outposts often held by a single platoon faced entire battalions, trading ground only at the cost of heavy casualties. Soldiers dug foxholes in the frozen earth, their shovels bouncing off rock-hard soil until explosives were used to break through. The 101st Airborne, seasoned from Normandy and Holland, fought with skill born of experience, but even their confidence could not mask the hardships. German artillery rained shells across the lines, destroying trees, flattening houses, and killing men in their dugouts. The fog and snow cloaked the battlefield, muffling sounds, and turning the world into a blur of white and fire. Yet, despite overwhelming odds, the Americans clung to the perimeter, refusing to yield the crossroads. The thin ring of defense held, fragile but unbroken. Inside the town, conditions grew harsher with every hour. Food stocks dwindled quickly, forcing soldiers and civilians alike onto meager rations of bread, beans, and whatever could be scavenged. Ammunition was conserved, with commanders ordering men to fire only when certain of a kill. Medical supplies were scarce, and field hospitals filled with wounded soldiers in cellars and barns, their cries echoing through the night. Doctors worked by candlelight, amputating limbs without anesthetic, improvising bandages from sheets and clothing. The wounded lay side by side with civilians, their suffering shared in the cold darkness of makeshift wards. Fuel shortages left vehicles immobile, forcing troops to huddle together for warmth or burn scraps of wood to survive the bitter nights. Frostbite spread among the defenders, blackening fingers and toes, rendering rifles difficult to hold. Yet morale, though tested, remained remarkably resilient, sustained by the knowledge that their stand was critical to halting the German advance. Bastogne was more than survival. It was defiance. The siege was grinding, but the spirit of resistance endured. The Germans, recognizing Bastogne's importance, launched repeated attacks to break the perimeter. Panzers rolled forward along narrow country roads, their tracks grinding through snow as Volksgrenadiers advanced behind them. At villages like Champs and Warden, furious battles erupted, with American bazooka teams and tank destroyers ambushing enemy armor at close range. Artillery units, low on shells, fired with precision, conserving every round to maximum effect. German infantry attempted infiltration through the woods, slipping between foxholes in the night, but paratroopers repelled them with rifles and grenades. The fog of winter turned every clash into a brutal close-quarters struggle where visibility was measured in yards. At times, positions changed hands multiple times in a single day, only to be clawed back in bloody counterattacks. Each German assault sought to choke off the town, to crush its defenders and seize the crossroads, yet each ended in stalemate. The perimeter bent but never broke. Bastogne was proving itself a fortress, not by walls but by the will of its defenders. Among the defenders, the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne became the symbol of resistance. Veterans of Normandy's hedgerows and Holland's dikes, they now fought in frozen forests and snow-choked villages. Their discipline and cohesion allowed them to hold lines far longer than numbers suggested possible. They knew every tree, every rise in the ground, and used the terrain to deadly advantage against German attackers. Tank destroyer crews braved the cold, hiding in ambush positions until enemy armor drew close, then unleashing point-blank fire. Infantry squads darted between foxholes, reinforcing weak points under constant bombardment. Engineers laid mines and felled trees, creating makeshift barricades that turned roads into killing zones. Officers moved among their men, reminding them that Bastogne was the key, that surrender was not an option. Civilians, watching these young soldiers, recognized the steel in their determination. The defense of Bastogne became more than a tactical necessity. It became a legend in the making. The German artillery fire never ceased, hammering the town and its defenders with relentless fury. Shells fell indiscriminately, destroying houses, churches, and barns, reducing much of Bastogne to rubble. Civilians huddled in basements, praying as walls shook and dust fell from the ceilings with each impact. Soldiers shared their rations with townspeople, forging bonds of survival amid the devastation. At night the skies glowed with fires, the smoke mingling with snowflakes to create a haze of death. Each bombardment killed more, yet each failed to break the resolve of the garrison. The constant shelling became part of life, endured with grim determination. Men joked bitterly that the Germans must be running out of shells by now, even as fresh barrages answered them. Every explosion was a reminder that they were surrounded, but also a reminder of their defiance. Bastogne endured, battered but unyielding. The morale of the defenders was tested not only by the Germans but by the weather itself. Snowstorms swept across the Ardennes, grounding Allied aircraft and cutting off any hope of immediate resupply. The cold was merciless, seeping into bones and freezing water in canteens before it could be drunk. Foxholes filled with snow and ice, forcing men to bail them out with helmets or risk frostbite. Gloves froze stiff, weapons jammed, and even the simplest tasks became monumental struggles. Some soldiers wrapped their feet in rags or newspapers to stave off frostbite, while others carried on with numb hands and blackened toes. Sleep was snatched in brief moments, interrupted by shelling or the threat of attack. Yet in the face of misery, humor survived. Men carved jokes into frozen logs or sang songs around small fires. Their defiance was not only in their rifles, but in their refusal to despair. The siege was a crucible, and it was forging legends out of ordinary men. As the days dragged on, Bastogne became both symbol and stronghold, embodying the stubborn resistance of the Allied armies in the Ardennes. German commanders threw division after division against it, convinced the crossroads must fall, but each assault ended in blood and frustration. The Americans inside the perimeter endured hunger, cold, and endless bombardment, yet refused to yield. Reports filtered out of their defiance, inspiring soldiers across the front and reassuring commanders that Bastogne was still holding. Eisenhower and Bradley knew that, as long as Bastogne resisted, the German timetable would crumble. Patton, racing north with his Third Army, vowed to break the siege and relieve the garrison at all costs. Inside the town, the 101st Airborne and their comrades prepared to endure whatever came. Their motto, as simple as it was unshakable: hold. The siege of Bastogne had become the focal point of the battle, a test of willpower as much as firepower, and in that test, the defenders proved that courage could turn even isolation into strength. As the German offensive roared westward, one of its most feared spearheads was Kampfgruppe Peiper, commanded by SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper, a veteran of the Eastern Front and a rising star in the Waffen-SS. Peiper commanded a hardened battle group of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. His force was a mix of Panthers, Tiger Tiers, Panzer IVs, half-tracks, artillery, and thousands of seasoned men. Their orders were clear: break through American lines, capture key crossings, and reach the Meuse River at lightning speed. Peiper's reputation for ruthless aggression preceded him. His men drilled to strike hard and show no mercy. On December 16, 1944, his Kampfgruppe surged into action, carving a path of destruction across the Ardennes. Villages fell quickly under their advance, their defenders cut down or overrun in a storm of fire and steel. American lines, thin and unprepared, buckled under the weight of this armored fist. Yet within days, Piper's advance would be remembered less for its speed than for the atrocity that followed. The name Malmedy would forever stain the record of the Ardennes offensive. On December 17th, Piper's Kampfgruppe pushed west near the Belgian town of Malmedy, encountering scattered American units retreating from the chaos. At Bognes, a crossroads south of Malmedy, Piper's tanks and infantry clashed with elements of the US 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. The Americans, lightly armed and poorly positioned, were quickly overwhelmed. Over 100 surrendered, their hands raised as German SS troops herded them into a field near the crossroads. The prisoners were stripped of equipment and ordered to stand in the freezing cold, surrounded by machine guns and tanks. Some believed they would soon be marched to the rear, as dictated by the rules of war. Others, aware of the SS's brutal reputation, whispered of darker fears. German guards barked orders, their weapons poised, while Piper's column pressed forward, leaving the prisoners behind under armed watch. What happened next became one of the darkest moments of the Western Front. In that frozen field, discipline gave way to slaughter. Without warning, German machine guns opened fire into the packed group of American prisoners. Men fell in rows, cut down before they could react, their bodies collapsing onto the snow. Some were killed instantly, bullets tearing through coats and helmets in a storm of violence. Others dropped and feigned death, praying the execution would pass them by. SS troops walked among the fallen, firing pistols into the wounded to ensure none remained alive. The field became a scene of carnage, blood soaking into the white snow under a pale winter sun. Dozens were left lifeless where they stood, executed in cold blood without trial or mercy. Those who managed to flee sprinted across the field and into nearby woods, pursued by gunfire. A handful reached safety, shivering and terrified, carrying word of the massacre to their comrades. The name Malmedy would spread like wildfire across the front lines. The war had entered a new level of brutality in the Ardennes. News of the massacre spread quickly among American units, carried by survivors who stumbled into friendly lines. Their stories, breathless and shocking, told of comrades machine-gunned while standing defenseless in the snow. Officers listened in disbelief, then rage, realizing the Waffen-SS had committed a flagrant war crime. The reports ignited fury among American soldiers, many of whom vowed to take no prisoners from that day forward. In the brutal calculus of war, mercy had been exchanged for vengeance. For frontline GIs, Malmedy became a rallying cry, a symbol of what they were fighting against. Rumors spread of other atrocities committed by Piper's men as they advanced, burning villages and killing civilians. Each tale reinforced the image of Kampfgruppe Piper as a marauding force of terror rather than a disciplined military unit. The massacre changed the tone of the battle, sharpening its savagery on both sides. Malmedy was no longer just a location, it was a scar upon the conscience of the war. The massacre itself was not an isolated act, but part of a broader pattern of brutality within Piper's command. His units, moving with speed and desperation, treated prisoners as burdens slowing their advance. Time was critical, and the orders from above emphasized aggression at all costs, leaving little room for humanity. Civilians fared no better, as villages were burned, homes destroyed, and inhabitants driven into the cold. The SS carried with them the legacy of atrocities committed in Russia, now transplanted onto the battlefields of the West. Piper himself later claimed He never ordered the killings, blaming them on battlefield confusion and subordinate initiative. Yet his leadership fostered the climate of ruthlessness in which such crimes flourished. In the field near Malmedy, military discipline had dissolved into murder, and no explanation could erase that stain. The massacre was a symptom of an army that no longer fought by rules, but by rage and desperation, and it left a legacy that would haunt the Ardennes long after the snow melted. For the survivors, the memory of Malmedy remained seared into their minds forever. Men recalled lying beneath the bodies of friends, hearing the footsteps of SS soldiers as they checked for life. They remembered the sting of bullets whizzing overhead as they fled, the sound of groans cut short by gunfire. Some described crawling through the snow for hours, their breath freezing, their bodies numb with fear and exhaustion. Others recounted stumbling into American lines, babbling incoherently of slaughter until officers forced calm from them. Each account added pieces to the picture of horror, a collective testimony of betrayal and brutality. Survivors carried not only physical scars, but the burden of memory, of knowing why their comrades did not return. The massacre was more than a tactical incident. It was a personal wound for every soldier who heard the story. For those men, the Ardennes would never again be just a battle. It had become a struggle against cruelty itself, embodied by the field at Malmedy. American commanders quickly recognized the importance of the massacre, both militarily and morally. Eisenhower's headquarters documented the incident, gathering survivor testimony and spreading word among units to steel their resolve. The massacre hardened American resistance, transforming fear into determination. Soldiers fought not just to repel the German offensive, but to avenge the fallen at Malmedy. Propaganda units used the atrocity as evidence of SS barbarity, reinforcing the righteousness of the Allied cause. For many, it erased lingering doubts about whether the war might soon end peacefully. Malmedy demonstrated that the enemy was still ruthless, still willing to murder rather than fight honorably. The massacre thus reshaped morale, ensuring that surrender was not an option and retreat not a consideration. It added a moral dimension to the already desperate struggle in the Ardennes. In the minds of many, Malmedy was proof that this battle was a test not only of strength, but of humanity itself. The Malmedy massacre remains one of the most infamous war crimes of the Western Front, a moment when brutality overshadowed the rules of civilized conflict. For the men of Kampfgruppe paper, it was one atrocity among many committed in their desperate thrust across Belgium. For the Americans, it was a galvanizing moment, transforming Bastogne, St. Vith, and every other battlefield into places of both defiance and retribution. Decades later, trials would hold some accountable, but no sentence could undo the suffering of that frozen field. The massacre stood as a reminder that even in the final months of war, savagery had not abated. The Ardennes, beautiful in its winter stillness, had been stained with blood shed not in battle but in murder. The victims of Malmedy lay as silent witnesses to the cruelty of war and the fragility of human restraint. Their deaths became part of the larger story of the Battle of the Bulge, shaping how it would be remembered. In history's pages, Malmedy is not a footnote but a warning, and its echo lingers, carried by the snow and silence of that fateful winter day. As the initial shock of the offensive tore through American lines, German panzer divisions surged westward with relentless urgency. Their objective was clear: the Meuse River, the final barrier before Antwerp, whose capture would split the Allied armies in two. Panther tanks led the charge, their sleek profiles and powerful guns giving them superiority over most American armor. Behind them came Panzer IV's Tiger IIIs and self-propelled guns, engines straining as they ground through frozen roads. Infantry clung to half-tracks and trucks, following close to the armored spearheads to exploit every breakthrough. In the first days, progress seemed swift. villages falling and crossroads captured in rapid succession. American defenders, stunned and disorganized, struggled to form coherent resistance against the armored tide. Yet even as momentum built, cracks began to appear in the German advance. The tanks were powerful, but they were also ravenous consumers of fuel, and fuel, more than enemy fire, threatened to halt the drive toward the Meuse. Hitler's grand design had envisioned his panzer armies reaching the Meuse in just 3 days, a timetable more fantasy than reality. The narrow forest roads of the Ardennes became bottlenecks, clogging with columns of armor, trucks, and horse-drawn wagons. Bridges collapsed under the weight of heavy tigers, forcing engineers to improvise repairs or detours. Traffic jams stretched for miles, with entire divisions immobilized for hours, while commanders struggled to untangle the chaos. Each delay gnawed at the timetable, giving the Allies precious hours to regroup. Fuel convoys lagged behind, their trucks struggling to navigate icy roads, and under constant threat of Allied air attack once the skies cleared. Every mile forward drained tanks that could not be easily refueled, forcing commanders to make brutal choices. Panthers were abandoned when their engines sputtered dry, crews detonating charges to deny them to the enemy. The offensive's power was undeniable, but its pace was faltering. The Ardennes was not yielding as easily as Hitler had promised. Among the spearheads, Kampfgruppe paper epitomized both the fury and the fragility of the German thrust. With nearly 5,000 men, 100 tanks, and hundreds of vehicles, Paper's column became the tip of the spear driving toward the Meuse. Its speed was legendary, its brutality infamous, as villages fell in flames and prisoners were left behind in shallow graves. But the faster Paper pushed, the more vulnerable his supply lines became. By the second day, fuel shortages already plagued his advance, forcing his tanks to seize Allied depots or risk running dry. Each burning American truck on the roadside was both an obstacle and a prize, its fuel tanks siphoned by desperate crews. German soldiers fought not only for ground but for gasoline, their offensive literally running on fumes. Paper's men pressed on, but their fate was already being written by the shortages that dogged them. No matter how ferocious their drive, without fuel even tigers became useless hulks. The Ardennes would punish speed as harshly as it punished hesitation. Elsewhere, the 5th Panzer Army under von Manteuffel advanced with more finesse, but encountered the same logistical nightmares. Manteuffel, an experienced strategist, urged his subordinates to maneuver with precision, bypassing resistance rather than wasting time in bloody assaults. His panzers captured towns like Hoffelais and Marche, pushing closer to the Meuse with methodical force. Yet every step forward stretched supply lines thinner, leaving rear units vulnerable and convoys delayed. Captured American fuel dumps became lifelines, fiercely contested in small battles as valuable as any tank engagement. German staff officers calculated fuel consumption with desperate urgency, aware that even minor missteps could doom the timetable. The deeper the panzers drove into Belgium, the more fragile their advance became. Still, the dream of reaching Antwerp burned brightly in Hitler's mind, even as reality corroded the offensive from within. Manteuffel's divisions pressed on, but time and fuel were no longer allies. They were enemies just as dangerous as the Americans regrouping ahead. The 7th Army on the southern flank struggled to keep pace, advancing slowly and tying down American units near Luxembourg. Their progress was plodding, limited by poor terrain, heavy resistance, and meager armored support. Yet even this slower advance contributed to the pressure on the Allies, forcing them to divert reserves southward. The German plan depended on unity of movement, with each army supporting the thrust toward the Meuse. But the 7th Army's delays compounded the overall logistical strain, clogging roads already overburdened by traffic. Trucks ran out of gasoline, horses collapsed under loads, and armored columns sat idle while supplies trickled forward. Winter weather slowed everything, snowstorms grounding air support and freezing men as they waited along the roads. For the soldiers caught in the logjam, the offensive felt less like a blitzkrieg and more like a crawl. Frustration grew, but orders demanded they push on at all costs. The Seventh Army's struggles revealed the fragile underbelly of Hitler's bold gamble. American resistance, though shattered at first, began to stiffen in the face of the German armored advance. At crossroads and small towns, scratch units of infantry, tank destroyers, and artillery fought delaying actions. These battles, though small in scale, bled the German timetable dry. At Stavelot and Stoumont, Paper's column was slowed by determined defences that forced him into costly fights. At Vith, a stubborn stand by the US 106th Infantry and 7th Armoured Divisions tied down German armour for nearly a week. Each delay was measured not only in miles, but in gallons of fuel consumed by idling tanks. Every hour lost brought the Meuse further out of reach. For the Germans, speed was essential, but speed was exactly what the Ardennes refused to grant them. The American army, underestimated by Hitler, was already beginning to rally. The race for the Meuse was becoming a race against time itself. Fuel shortages soon dictated the shape of the battle, more than strategy or firepower. German panzer crews often found themselves stranded, their machines silent hulks on icy roadsides. Some abandoned their tanks and joined infantry columns on foot. Others waited desperately for supply trucks that never came. In villages, captured American fuel became the prize of brutal skirmishes, men dying over barrels of gasoline. The offensive's brilliance in concept was being undone by its logistical weakness in practice. Hitler had gambled that captured Allied supplies would sustain his armies, but the gamble was failing. Allied engineers destroyed fuel depots as they retreated, denying the Germans the lifeblood they needed. The Ardennes became littered with wrecks, not from combat alone, but from starvation of fuel. For the Germans, the dream of the Meuse began slipping away with each tank abandoned in the snow. The armour was still on the move, but its momentum was bleeding out. By the end of the first week, German panzer divisions remained far from the Meuse, their progress slowed by resistance, terrain, and exhaustion. The initial fury of the breakthrough had given way to the grind of attrition and logistical collapse. Commanders urged their men forward, but every mile seemed harder than the last, every gallon of fuel more precious than gold. Villages captured with such speed now became traps, as Allied reinforcements closed in on flanks and rear. The dream of Antwerp, so clear in Hitler's vision, was fading into unreality. The panzers were still advancing, but the clock was running out. Allied commanders were mobilizing reserves, and the weather would soon clear, unleashing Allied air power. The German armour was still on the move, but its race had already been lost in the snow. What remained was no longer about reaching the Meuse, but about surviving the coming counterblow. The Ardennes had swallowed Hitler's timetable whole. News of the German breakthrough reached Allied high command in a wave of confusion and disbelief. Reports flooded in from scattered units, each describing columns of panzers, artillery, and infantry surging westward through the Ardennes. At first, many officers dismissed it as a diversion, a feint meant to draw reserves away from the true front in the north. But by December 17th, the scale of the offensive became undeniable, with Bastogne, St. Vith, and Malmedy all under threat. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, recognized immediately that this was no raid but a full-scale assault. Gathered with his staff at Supreme Headquarters, he listened grimly as maps filled with German arrows pushing toward the Meuse. His calm demeanor masked urgency as he issued orders to stabilize the line and rush reinforcements into Belgium. Unlike Hitler, Eisenhower was not prone to fantasy. He saw the crisis for what it was. The Germans had gambled everything on this strike, and the Allies needed to respond with equal decisiveness. The counterstroke of command had begun. The first priority was reinforcement, and Eisenhower wasted no time in moving reserves into the fray. The veteran 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, resting in France after months of fighting in Holland, were ordered north with all speed. Within hours, paratroopers were loading onto trucks, their faces grim as they realized another brutal campaign awaited. Armored divisions such as the 7th and 10th were dispatched to critical crossroads, tasked with holding back panzers until more forces arrived. Supply convoys roared down frozen highways, headlights dimmed, carrying fuel, ammunition, and rations to battered frontline units. Eisenhower understood the stakes. The Ardennes was not a side theatre, but the very hinge of the Western Front. If the Germans reached Antwerp, the Allied armies would be severed, and the war prolonged indefinitely. Orders went out to British commanders as well, with Montgomery's forces in the north preparing to support American defenses. Every available unit was called to action, regardless of fatigue or distance. Eisenhower's calm but firm direction gave coherence to the chaotic first days of the battle. Within the high command, debates flared over the scale of the response. General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. 12th Army Group, initially argued that the attack was limited and could be contained with minimal reserves. But Eisenhower saw further, recognizing that the Germans had committed their best panzer divisions to the offensive. He overruled hesitation, insisting that entire corps must be diverted immediately to reinforce the Ardennes. Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army in the south, telephoned headquarters with assurances that his divisions could pivot north within days. His aggressive confidence contrasted sharply with the shock felt by many staff officers. Eisenhower listened, nodded, and ordered Patton to prepare a massive counterstroke toward Bastogne. This was not just reinforcement, it was the deliberate shaping of a counteroffensive. Eisenhower's genius lay not in panic but in clarity of thought under pressure. By moving swiftly, he ensured the German timetable would collapse before their armor ever reached the Meuse. The weather, cruel and relentless, complicated every effort to rush reinforcements. Snowstorms blanketed roads, freezing engines, slowing convoys, and bogging down tanks in drifts. Trucks skidded across ice, their tires wrapped with chains, while soldiers huddled beneath blankets in open beds. Air support, the Allies' greatest strength, was grounded for days by low clouds and thick fog. Eisenhower knew that until the skies cleared, his forces would be fighting blind, without the protective umbrella of fighter bombers. Every delay gave the Germans more time to advance, and every hour mattered. Yet convoys pressed on, columns of headlights winding through the night, moving men and machines into Belgium. Military police directed traffic at choke points, ensuring that tanks and artillery reached the front first. Despite hardships, the reinforcements kept coming, their determination as formidable as the weather. The Ardennes was swallowing everything, but Eisenhower was feeding it steel and resolve. Among Eisenhower's staff, the weight of decision was immense, but his leadership steadied the room. He gathered his generals and calmly laid out the facts. The Germans had struck with their last reserves, and this was their final gamble. If the Allies held, the enemy would be broken. If they failed, the war might drag on for another year. There was no margin for error, no time for hesitation. Eisenhower's confidence radiated, assuring even doubtful subordinates that the situation was serious but far from lost. He emphasized coordination between American and British commands, rejecting any notion of rivalry in the face of crisis. His orders were concise, his tone firm, and his vision unwavering: stop the Germans at all costs, then counterattack. This clarity of command filtered down the chain, giving purpose to every truck driver, rifleman, and artilleryman racing toward the front. In Eisenhower's steady voice, the Allies found their anchor. Leadership in the storm mattered as much as men and tanks. Reinforcements began to arrive in the Ardennes, just as the German offensive threatened to fracture the American front. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne dug in, turning the crossroads town into a fortress of defiance. At St. Vith, American armored divisions fought a delaying action that held up entire Panzer Corps. Along the northern shoulder, the 82nd Airborne plugged critical gaps, their paratroopers marching through snow to occupy defensive lines. Eisenhower's strategy of rapid reinforcement was paying dividends, slowing the German timetable with each passing day. The panzers had expected open roads. Instead, they encountered paratroopers with bazookas and tank destroyers lying in ambush. Every hour bought by these reinforcements allowed more divisions to flow into Belgium. The Allied line, though battered, was no longer crumbling. Eisenhower's decision to commit reserves decisively had transformed retreat into resistance. The Ardennes was now a battlefield of stubborn defense, not panicked flight. Eisenhower also recognized the political stakes of the battle, understanding that unity among the Allies was as crucial as battlefield success. He communicated constantly with Churchill and Roosevelt, assuring them that the offensive would be contained. At the same time, he coordinated with Montgomery in the north, granting the British commander temporary authority over the northern sector. This decision, though controversial among Americans, ensured that command lines were streamlined and confusion avoided. Eisenhower placed victory above ego, demonstrating the discipline that had made him supreme commander. While German generals quarreled under Hitler's rigid control, the Allied command adapted fluidly to crisis. The contrast in leadership was stark, and it shaped the battle's outcome as much as tanks or guns. Eisenhower's willingness to delegate and trust his subordinates created a flexibility the Germans lacked. In the darkest days of the Ardennes, Allied unity held firm because his vision demanded it. Leadership was the silent weapon of the battle. By late December, Eisenhower's response had transformed the Ardennes offensive from a German surge into a battle of attrition. The panzers were slowed, their fuel dwindling, and their timetable shattered. Reinforcements continued to pour in, bringing fresh strength to tired defenders and forming the nucleus of the coming counteroffensive. Eisenhower had seized control of the crisis, turning shock into strategy, chaos into cohesion. The German gamble had drawn blood, but it had failed to break Allied resolve. The Ardennes was no longer the scene of retreat. It was the crucible of Allied resilience. Eisenhower's decisions, calm and precise under pressure, ensured that the German dream of splitting the Western Front would collapse. His response had been not only military, but moral, proving that leadership could shape the course of history in hours of peril. The siege of Bastogne still raged. The Meuse was still threatened, but the tide was shifting. The Allied High Command had answered the German gamble, and the answer was iron. While Bastogne shivered under siege and Eisenhower scrambled reinforcements, one general saw opportunity where others saw crisis. George S. Patton, commander of the U.S. Third Army, was already preparing for a move north before Eisenhower issued the order. Known for his aggressive instincts and rapid maneuvers, Patton had anticipated a German strike and kept his divisions on alert. At a commanders' conference in Verdun on December 19th, Eisenhower asked who could relieve Bastogne the fastest. Patton stunned the room by declaring he could pivot 3 divisions north within 48 hours. His staff had been working on contingency plans in secret, rehearsing the logistics of turning an entire army 90 degrees in the dead of winter. Eisenhower, skeptical but impressed, gave Patton the mission without hesitation. The fate of Bastogne now rested on the shoulders of a man who thrived in impossible situations. It was the kind of challenge Patton had been waiting for his entire career. The Third Army was about to march into history. Patton's staff, the backbone of his army, executed the maneuver with astonishing speed and precision. Tens of thousands of men, tanks, artillery and trucks had to pivot from eastward operations against the Saar to a northward thrust into Belgium. Road networks were congested with fleeing civilians, retreating units and supply convoys, yet Patton's planners cleared routes with ruthless efficiency. Military police directed traffic day and night, ensuring armored columns moved without delay. The weather added cruelty to complexity, with snow and ice making every mile a hazard. Soldiers marched through blizzards, their breath freezing in the air, as convoys rumbled past abandoned vehicles and wrecks. Tank crews fought engines as much as the enemy, coaxing their Shermans through snowdrifts and over slick bridges. Artillery units, slowed by mud and ice, dragged their guns forward to provide fire support for the advance. Every division moved like a gear in Patton's machine, grinding northward without pause. It was mobility turned into weapon, and Patton wielded it with unmatched skill. Patton himself was everywhere. His presence felt at every level of the march. Dressed in his signature helmet and riding in his command car, he toured the columns, exhorting his men to greater effort. He spoke with tank crews, infantrymen, and engineers, reminding them that their mission was not just tactical but historic. Bastogne, he told them, was the key to the entire battle, and if it fell, the Germans might reach the Meuse. His confidence was contagious, turning fatigue into determination and fear into resolve. Soldiers who had marched for days found new strength when they saw Patton along the road. He demanded speed but rewarded it with praise, knowing that morale was as important as fuel. In his headquarters, he drove his staff relentlessly, pushing them to anticipate every obstacle before it appeared. He was harsh, he was demanding, but he inspired belief that victory was inevitable. In the frozen Ardennes, Patton's personality was as vital as his tanks. Leadership was moving north with him, mile by mile. The Third Army's advance was not without resistance, and German units along the southern shoulder sought to block Patton's thrust. Skirmishes erupted in villages and forests as German rearguards attempted to slow the American tide. Patton's divisions brushed them aside with ferocity, combining tanks, artillery, and infantry in rapid assaults. Engineers built bridges under fire, allowing Shermans and half-tracks to surge forward across icy rivers. Air support was still grounded by snow and fog, leaving the Third Army to fight alone against ambushes and counterattacks. Yet the momentum never faltered, with Patton's commanders urging their units onward, knowing time was their greatest enemy. Each village cleared, and each ridge seized brought Bastogne closer within reach. German opposition was brave but disorganized, their fuel shortages as crippling as their dwindling manpower. The Third Army was proving unstoppable, not because the path was easy, but because its will was unbreakable. Bastogne was drawing nearer, and with it redemption for the Ardennes front. Inside Bastogne, the defenders of the 101st Airborne fought on with dwindling supplies, unaware of the exact progress of their relief. Patton's timetable was a race against starvation, frostbite, and the relentless hammering of German artillery. Communications were limited, but Eisenhower's headquarters assured McAuliffe's garrison that help was on the way. In reality, the burden of that promise fell squarely on Patton's shoulders and the steel tracks of his tanks. Every hour of delay meant more casualties in the encircled town, more wounded in cellars without medicine. Patton drove his divisions harder, demanding speed that tested both men and machines to their limits. Infantry marched until their boots split, while tank crews slept in their vehicles between fuel stops. Convoys of supply trucks followed close behind, loaded with food and ammunition for the besieged paratroopers. Patton's advance was not only a military maneuver, but a race of humanity against time, and he intended to win that race, no matter the cost. By December 22nd, the spearheads of Patton's Third Army were approaching the outskirts of Bastogne. Snow-covered fields and frozen forests marked the final approach, where German artillery and rearguards fought desperately to hold the ring around the town. Skirmishes erupted along the roads, forcing tank columns to fight house by house through Belgian villages. Artillery barrages lit up the night sky, shaking the ground as both sides poured fire into contested crossroads. The closer Patton's men came, the more ferocious the resistance grew, for the Germans knew Bastogne's fall would shatter their offensive. American infantry advanced through waist-deep snow, rifles freezing in their hands, while tanks blasted holes through defensive positions. Supply convoys crept forward behind the guns, preparing to bring relief to the starving defenders. Each mile was paid for in blood, but the momentum remained with the Third Army. Patton's machine was grinding relentlessly toward its goal. Bastogne was within sight, its salvation almost at hand. Patton's leadership during the drive north demonstrated not just tactical brilliance, but a mastery of logistics. His staff managed an army-sized movement with a precision few commanders could have matched. Fuel depots were relocated, ammunition redistributed, and supply routes redirected in a matter of hours. Divisions pivoted on icy roads without collapsing into chaos, a feat that astonished even Eisenhower's staff. The Third Army's ability to execute such a maneuver in the depths of winter became one of the great logistical achievements of the war. It was not merely Patton's charisma, but his planning that made the impossible seem routine. He trusted his commanders to execute, but he demanded excellence at every level. This combination of vision and discipline transformed the Third Army into a weapon of extraordinary flexibility. In the Ardennes, that flexibility saved Bastogne from certain destruction. The relief of the town became proof that Allied command was not only resilient but dynamic. On December 26, 1944, Patton's lead elements broke through to Bastogne, linking up with the weary but unyielding defenders of the 101st. The siege had been lifted, the encirclement broken, and the German dream of capturing the crossroads shattered. Paratroopers, gaunt and exhausted, cheered as Shermans rolled into town, their stars visible through the snow and smoke. Supplies flowed in behind the tanks, bringing food, ammunition, and medicine to the besieged garrison. For the men of Bastogne, the sight of Patton's armor was salvation made real. For the Germans it was the death knell of their offensive, proof that the Meuse was forever out of reach. Patton's maneuver became legend, a testament to speed, audacity, and relentless willpower. Eisenhower had trusted him with the mission, and Patton had delivered in spectacular fashion. Bastogne was saved, and with it, the Allied line in the Ardennes. The Third Army had turned north, and in doing so, it had turned the tide of the Battle of the Bulge. For nearly a week, the Ardennes had been ruled by fog, snow, and low cloud, granting the Germans a rare advantage. The Luftwaffe, though weakened, had managed to fly sorties unmolested, while Allied air power was grounded in frustration. On December 23, 1944, the skies finally began to clear, and with that break in the weather came the full weight of Allied air superiority. Bombers and fighters roared into the frigid skies, engines echoing across snow-covered valleys and villages. P-47, Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, and British Typhoons swept overhead, their wings glinting in the winter sun. They scoured roads, bridges, and towns, seeking out German convoys clogged in the snow. What had been columns of panzers and fuel trucks suddenly became burning wrecks, their smoke rising into the bright blue sky. American soldiers on the ground cheered as they saw squadrons dive through the clouds to attack. The tide of battle was turning not only on the ground, but now decisively in the air. The skies belonged to the Allies once more. For the German armies, the return of Allied aircraft was nothing short of catastrophic. The offensive had depended on speed, but speed required fuel, and fuel convoys were the first victims of strafing runs. Trucks packed with gasoline exploded in fireballs, turning narrow forest roads into blazing infernos. Columns of armor once feared found themselves trapped on roads choked with wreckage. Crews abandoned their tanks as thunderbolts swooped low, firing rockets and machine guns into the steel monsters. Bridges critical to German logistics were reduced to rubble by precision bombing, cutting off entire divisions from resupply. The Luftwaffe attempted to contest the skies, but their numbers were too few, their pilots too inexperienced to match seasoned Allied aces. Every attempt at counterattack was met with overwhelming force, the Germans losing planes faster than they could replace them. What Hitler had promised as a lightning advance was now bogged down by burning convoys and shattered supply lines. The offensive's fate was being sealed from the heavens. The impact was felt most acutely by Kampfgruppe Paper, whose panzers had spearheaded the thrust toward the Meuse. Already hampered by fuel shortages and fierce ground resistance, Paper's column now became a prime target for Allied fighter bombers. Road after road was strafed, vehicles destroyed, and precious fuel supplies annihilated. Tanks that had once rolled confidently forward now sat stranded, their crews helpless as the skies erupted with firepower. Survivors recalled watching P-40 7C descend like hawks, unleashing streams of bullets that tore through trucks and half-tracks. Men scrambled into ditches, pressed against frozen earth as bombs shook the ground. Each strike whittled away at Paper's strength, turning his once formidable spearhead into a scattered, starving remnant. His dream of reaching the Meuse disintegrated beneath the relentless thunder of Allied planes. The Luftwaffe could offer no shield, leaving German soldiers to curse the skies they could not control. Paper's advance was not defeated in a single battle, but in countless strafing runs and bomb craters. Air power also brought new life to the besieged garrison of Bastogne. With the weather clearing, C-47 transport planes appeared overhead, parachuting supplies into the encircled town. Food, ammunition, and medical kits tumbled from the sky, landing in fields and streets, where desperate paratroopers raced to collect them. For the 101st Airborne, the sight of parachutes billowing in the cold air was nothing short of salvation. German artillery tried to disrupt the drops, but Allied pilots pressed on with fearless determination. Thousands of tons of supplies were delivered in just a few days, sustaining the garrison until Patton's relief arrived. Wounded men received precious bandages and medicine, while riflemen once again had bullets to load. The skies, which had once sealed Bastogne's doom with snow and fog, now carried its salvation. The symbolism was not lost on the men trapped inside. The Allies had seized back the initiative. Bastogne would endure because the heavens themselves had reopened. On the broader battlefield, the Allied air forces turned the Ardennes into a nightmare for German logistics. Reconnaissance planes identified columns of reinforcements and relayed coordinates to bomber squadrons. Villages used as supply depots were blasted apart, their stores of ammunition and fuel destroyed in fiery explosions. Rail lines, critical for moving men and material from Germany, were shattered by repeated strikes. German commanders found themselves forced to move at night, hiding in forests by day, always wary of the next attack. Even so, Allied night bombers prowled the skies, ensuring that darkness offered no true safety. Every destroyed bridge, every cratered road, slowed the advance and starved the offensive. Hitler had wagered on surprise and momentum, but momentum could not survive in the crosshairs of Allied pilots. The Ardennes offensive was bleeding not just from enemy fire, but from the surgical strikes of air power. The Luftwaffe had been eclipsed, and with it the German dream of victory in the West. For the men on the ground, the return of Allied planes carried a profound psychological weight. American soldiers dug into foxholes, cheered as they saw fighters streaking overhead, knowing the skies now favored them. Confidence spread across the front, replacing despair with determination. Conversely, German morale crumbled as every engine rumble overhead promised destruction. Crews huddled in forests, terrified of venturing into the open, their offensive spirit drained by constant bombardment. Soldiers wrote in diaries of the terror of air raids, the feeling of helplessness as bombs rained from above. The battle was no longer confined to tanks and rifles. It was a struggle shaped by the mastery of the air. The Allies had reclaimed their greatest advantage, and it tilted the balance irreversibly. The skies had become a weapon, wielded with precision and fury. In that weapon, the fate of the Ardennes was being written. The return of air power also showcased the vast industrial might behind the Allied war effort. Thousands of aircraft could be deployed at will, their losses quickly replaced, their crews well trained. In contrast, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, reduced to a fraction of its strength by years of attrition. German pilots, many barely out of training, faced Allied veterans who had fought over Normandy, Italy, and the Channel. Factories in America and Britain churned out planes faster than Germany could destroy them, ensuring Allied dominance was permanent. This disparity was not just numerical, it was systemic, reflecting the collapse of German capacity to sustain modern war. Each dogfight over the Ardennes was a microcosm of that larger truth. Germany could no longer compete. The Ardennes offensive had been Hitler's last gamble, but in the skies the cards were stacked against him. Air power revealed the imbalance with devastating clarity, and once revealed it could not be undone. By the final days of December, Allied planes had transformed the Ardennes battlefield into a graveyard of German ambition. Burned-out tanks lined roadsides, fuel trucks lay scattered in blackened wrecks, and columns of infantry trudged through snow without supplies. The offensive, once terrifying in its speed, had slowed to a crawl under the weight of destruction from above. Bastogne was supplied, the Meuse remained secure, and the Germans were now on the defensive. The sky itself had become the Allies' most powerful weapon, ensuring that momentum shifted irreversibly. Soldiers on the ground would later recall that the turning point was not one battle, but the moment the weather cleared. In the bright winter sun of late December, the Luftwaffe's shadow vanished, replaced by Allied wings. The Ardennes offensive had been broken not only by grit on the ground, but by dominance in the air. Victory, once uncertain, was now inevitable. The sky had returned to the Allies, and with it, the future of the war in Europe. The Ardennes offensive was not fought on empty fields, but across villages and farms that had stood for centuries in Belgium and Luxembourg. When the panzers surged forward in December 1944, they rolled directly through towns where families were celebrating Christmas, Houses shook as artillery thundered, and children who had hung decorations the night before now cowered in cellars. The people of the Ardennes had already endured 4 years of German occupation and now found themselves at the epicenter of Europe's last great battle. Many villages were bombarded indiscriminately, not because they held military targets, but because they lay in the path of advancing columns. Civilians fled with what little they could carry, trudging through snow beside retreating American troops or terrified refugees. Others stayed behind, forced into their homes by bitter cold or the impossibility of escape. Entire communities were shattered in hours, their lives rewritten by fire and steel. The Ardennes, once a quiet winter landscape, became a battlefield of human suffering. For its people there was no safe place. Bastogne, already encircled, was a town transformed into a fortress, and its civilians shared in the ordeal of the garrison. Families huddled in damp cellars as shells collapsed roofs and walls above them. Food supplies dwindled quickly, leaving parents to divide crusts of bread among children who cried from hunger. Water froze in buckets, forcing people to melt snow just to drink. The wounded were brought into homes turned into improvised hospitals, where civilians and soldiers lay side by side. Mothers cradled children in the darkness as German artillery pounded relentlessly, shaking the ground like earthquakes. Some townspeople dug deeper shelters, hollowing out caves beneath their houses to survive the barrages. Yet despite fear and deprivation, many shared what little they had with American paratroopers defending the town. Bastogne's civilians endured the same siege as the soldiers, caught in a crucible of hunger, cold, and terror. For them, the battle was not strategy, it was survival. Elsewhere in the Ardennes, villages like Stavelot and Malmedy became scenes of tragedy. In Stavelot, civilians were trapped between German and American forces as fighting raged street by street. When SS troops swept through, accusations of aiding the Allies brought brutal reprisals. Entire families were shot in their homes, and survivors recalled the sound of boots kicking in doors before gunfire echoed through frozen streets. In Malmedy, the massacre of American prisoners shocked the world, but civilians too were murdered in cold blood. Houses were burned to the ground as examples, leaving people homeless in the depths of winter. Refugees wandered through snow-choked forests, carrying infants wrapped in blankets, their faces hollow with exhaustion. Some were caught in crossfire, their lives ended without warning in fields or roadsides. These acts of cruelty revealed the desperation and savagery of an army lashing out as its timetable faltered. Civilians were no longer bystanders, they were victims. Everywhere the cold compounded the misery. Temperatures plunged below freezing, snowdrifts blocked roads, and bitter winds cut through even the warmest clothes. Families without firewood tore apart furniture to keep stoves burning. Children shivered under thin blankets, while shells whistled overhead. Hunger gnawed at villages where livestock had been slaughtered or stolen by advancing troops. Mothers boiled watery soups from scraps, feeding their children before themselves. Illness spread in the cold with no medicine available to stop fevers or infections. The sound of crying mingled with the thunder of artillery, echoing across villages already half ruined by bombs. For civilians, the battle was not measured in lines on maps, but in empty stomachs and frozen nights. The Ardennes winter was merciless, turning survival into a daily miracle. The war had come to their doorsteps, and there was no escape from its grasp. Despite the suffering, civilians played crucial roles in aiding Allied soldiers. Villagers guided lost units through woods and fields, using knowledge of the terrain to bypass enemy patrols. Some hid American soldiers cut off from their units, sheltering them in barns or cellars at the risk of execution. Women nursed wounded GIs with whatever supplies they could find, even as their own families starved. Farmers provided hay for bedding, barns for shelter, and occasional food to men preparing for counterattacks. In Bastogne, townspeople cheered as supply drops parachuted from the sky, knowing the soldiers' survival meant their own. Stories emerged of civilians standing alongside troops in firefights, carrying ammunition or relaying messages under fire. These acts of quiet heroism reminded soldiers that they were fighting not only for victory, but for the lives of ordinary people. The bond between liberator and liberated deepened in those frozen days. Civilians, though powerless in arms, wielded courage in the face of annihilation. Their sacrifice became part of the battle's legend. The brutality of the German advance left scars that lasted long after the snow melted. Families returned to homes reduced to rubble, possessions looted or burned, livelihoods destroyed, churches and schools were shattered, their walls pocked with bullet holes, their windows blasted out. Entire towns were emptied of their populations, scattered across Belgium in refugee columns. Survivors carried memories of terror that never faded: the crack of rifles, the sight of neighbors killed, the endless hunger. Children who had witnessed massacres or lost parents grew up haunted by those frozen days. In some places, graves dotted fields where families buried loved ones with no time for ceremony. When the Germans finally retreated, they left behind destruction that could not be repaired quickly. For civilians, the end of the battle was only the beginning of rebuilding shattered lives. The Ardennes offensive had been Hitler's gamble, but it was the villagers who paid the price. Personal accounts captured the human cost in voices that history cannot ignore. Survivors wrote of huddling in barns with animals, listening as tanks rumbled past their doors. Children remembered the smell of smoke and the cold touch of snow on bare feet as they fled through fields. Women told of waiting in silence as soldiers searched their homes, praying their families would be spared. Priests described churches turned into makeshift hospitals, altars piled with bandages and stretchers. Farmers recalled the desperation of soldiers, both American and German, who begged for food they did not have. These stories, preserved in diaries, letters, and memories, give life to the statistics of war. They show that the Battle of the Bulge was not only fought by armies, but endured by innocents. The suffering of civilians was as much a part of the battle as the clash of tanks. Their voices remain echoes of the war's true cost, and those echoes demand remembrance. When historians recall the Battle of the Bulge, they often focus on Bastogne, Patton's relief, or the clash of panzers. But the people of the Ardennes carried scars that lasted far beyond the headlines of victory. For them, the battle was not a campaign, but a nightmare lived hour by hour. It was hunger and cold, loss and fear, and the memory of neighbors who did not survive. Their villages were battlegrounds, their homes were ruins, and their lives were upended in the name of strategy. Yet amidst the devastation, they endured with resilience, sheltering soldiers, surviving bombardments, and rebuilding from ashes. Their suffering was the silent foundation upon which Allied victory rested. Without their endurance, the battle would have had no context, no meaning beyond maps and maneuvers. The Ardennes was not only a battlefield of armies, but of families, and their story remains inseparable from the legacy of the Bulge. The Ardennes in December 1944 was a labyrinth of dense pine forests, snow-choked clearings, and winding trails that twisted through the hills. It was here, among the trees and frozen villages, that much of the Battle of the Bulge unfolded, not as sweeping maneuvers, but as brutal small-unit combat. Platoons and squads stumbled through drifts of snow, rifles at the ready, never sure if the next tree line hid friend or foe. The forest swallowed sound, muffling movements, until a sudden burst of machine gun fire shattered the silence. Visibility was short, turning every skirmish into a deadly guessing game where the enemy might be 10 yards away or 100. Men hugged the frozen ground, their breath rising in white clouds, while mortars exploded overhead, showering branches and snow like shrapnel. Tanks were nearly useless in the woods, confined to narrow paths, leaving infantry to fight face to face in the undergrowth. Combat became intimate and terrifying, measured in foxholes and tree trunks, rather than fields and towns. Soldiers fought not for ground, but for survival in the endless cold. The Ardennes forest was no longer quiet, it was alive with death. For the Americans, the shock of the German advance meant squads were often cut off, isolated, and left to fight on their own. Small groups of GIs dug foxholes beneath pines, the snow packed around them like walls of ice. Machine gunners set up along ridgelines, their fields of fire barely reaching 100 yards before the forest swallowed the view. Patrols moved cautiously, ears straining for the snap of a twig or the murmur of German voices carried on the wind. Grenades became as common as rifles, tossed blindly into darkness where the enemy might be hiding. Mortar teams fired round after round into the trees, their explosions shattering branches that rained down in deadly splinters. Snow mixed with blood until the ground itself seemed scarred by the violence. Men fought cold as much as the enemy, their fingers numb on triggers, rifles freezing in the biting air. Command was often reduced to sergeants and lieutenants making decisions in the chaos. The woods turned generals' plans into soldiers' struggles. German infantry, hardened by years of war, moved with ruthless efficiency through the trees. Wearing white camouflage smocks, they blended with the snow, appearing suddenly and vanishing just as quickly. Their patrols struck without warning, laying ambushes along narrow trails and roads. SS units advanced with precision, their machine guns positioned to crossfire into American lines. At night, the forests became even more dangerous, with infiltrators slipping through gaps and sowing panic in rear areas. German artillery added to the terror, shells detonating among the trees and sending splinters of wood slicing like knives. Villages hidden within the forests became fortresses, houses turned into bunkers and barns into machine gun nests. Every advance required house-to-house fighting, grenades clearing rooms where rifles could not. Civilians huddled in cellars as their homes became battlefields, their villages consumed by flames. The German tactics were brutal but effective, slowing the American counterattacks to a crawl. The woods became their shield and their weapon. For soldiers on both sides, the confusion of forest fighting was relentless. Maps were nearly useless, and radios often failed in the thick terrain, leaving units cut off from higher command. Squads wandered into ambushes because they had lost their bearings, mistaking one trail for another. Friendly fire incidents were tragically common, as soldiers in snow-covered uniforms mistook allies for enemies in the blur of smoke and fog. A shouted password or a poorly pronounced phrase could mean life or death in the darkness. Panic could spread as quickly as gunfire, whole platoons retreating from shadows they believed were panzers. Leaders were forced to rely on runners, who risked their lives dashing through the woods under fire to deliver orders. In the end, the battle in the Ardennes forests was often decided not by strategy, but by the bravery of individuals in chaotic moments. The woods consumed order and replaced it with instinct. War here was primal, reduced to survival in the snow. The villages dotting the Ardennes became focal points of savage fighting. Places like Foy, Neuville, and L'Église were reduced to ruins, as houses were blasted apart by artillery and tanks. Streets clogged with rubble became killing grounds, with snipers firing from shattered windows and machine guns hidden in basements. Civilians fled or hid in barns, their homes transformed into strongpoints in a battle not of their choosing. American paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne fought through these villages with grenades, bayonets, and sheer determination. German SS units responded with equal ferocity, their discipline hardened by years of brutal campaigns. The result was combat at its most intimate, room by room, house by house, wall by wall. Frozen corpses lay in doorways, snow-stained red where men had fallen. Every village was a battlefield, every street a line of defense. The Ardennes countryside became a patchwork of ruins, each one bitterly contested. The cold and snow made combat even more savage, punishing soldiers as harshly as any bullet. Frostbite spread rapidly among men who lacked proper winter gear, turning fingers black and robbing soldiers of the ability to hold their rifles. Snow blinded machine gunners and clogged rifles, while boots froze solid after hours in icy foxholes. Soldiers stuffed their boots with rags or newspapers, desperate to keep circulation in their feet. Medics struggled to evacuate the wounded, their stretchers slipping across ice and snow while shells fell around them. Fires for warmth drew artillery, forcing men to choose between freezing in silence or risking bombardment. At night, soldiers slept huddled together under blankets stiff with frost, listening for the next attack. The Ardennes winter was relentless, cutting into morale and stamina with every passing hour. To fight in the woods was to fight both man and nature, each as deadly as the other. The cold was an enemy without mercy. Amidst the chaos, acts of courage shone through the darkness. Squads fought to the last man to hold crossroads that prevented German armor from breaking through. Machine gunners remained at their posts until overrun, buying precious minutes for comrades to retreat. Medics crawled through snow under fire, dragging wounded men back to safety. Officers rallied shattered units, leading counterattacks with nothing but pistols and determination. Civilians sheltered soldiers in their barns, risking execution if discovered by SS patrols. Soldiers wrote letters in foxholes, telling families of their struggles and their hope to survive another day. Men who had once been farmers, clerks, or mechanics fought like seasoned veterans, their survival instincts honed by fire and frost. The forests created heroes in moments unseen by history books, remembered only by those who survived. The Battle of the Bulge was not won in grand maneuvers alone, but in these desperate struggles of small units. In the Ardennes woods, war was measured in courage as much as blood. By January, as the German offensive faltered, the forests of the Ardennes bore silent witness to the ferocity of the struggle. Trees stood splintered and blackened, their trunks scarred by bullets and shells. Villages were reduced to ashes, their streets littered with burned-out vehicles and shattered lives. The snow concealed the bodies of fallen soldiers, Allied and German alike, scattered where they had fought and died. Survivors emerged from the woods, exhausted and hollow-eyed, carrying stories of battles fought at arm's length. The Ardennes, once quiet and beautiful, had become a graveyard for thousands. Yet in that crucible, the Allied line had held, and the German offensive had been blunted. The brutality of the fighting in the woods revealed both the savagery of war and the resilience of those who endured it. The Ardennes forest had tested armies, but it had also tested humanity itself. And in its frozen silence, history was written tree by tree, foxhole by foxhole. St. Vith was not a large city, nor was it one of the Allies' most fortified positions. Yet in December 1944, it became the anchor of a defense that would alter the course of the Ardennes offensive. Located in eastern Belgium, St. Vith sat at a vital crossroads where 7 roads converged, controlling movement across the region. To the Germans, capturing the town quickly was essential for their timetable, opening the way to the Meuse River and beyond. But the defense of St. Vith would prove unexpectedly stubborn, as American units rallied in the snow to deny the Wehrmacht its prize. The town's location amid thick forests and rolling hills made it both a liability and an opportunity. Its streets could be shelled into ruins, yet its surrounding terrain offered defenders strong positions to block the advance. The German timetable depended on speed, and any delay threatened the entire offensive. Thus, the struggle for St. Vith was about more than one town. It was about momentum, and in war, momentum often meant victory or defeat. The American forces holding St. Vith were a patchwork of units, but together they formed a defensive bulwark that became known as the fortress in the forest. Central to the defense was the battered 106th Infantry Division, new to combat and thrown into the line just as the German attack began. Alongside them fought the experienced 7th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Robert Hasbrouck, whose tanks and artillery would play a crucial role in the coming battle. Additional support came from elements of the 9th Armored and 28th Infantry Divisions, pieced together under emergency orders. Brigadier General Bruce C. Clark emerged as one of the key leaders, directing a skillful defense with limited resources. His ability to maneuver tanks and infantry in the dense terrain gave the Americans an edge against numerically superior German forces. The defenders dug in amid snow and frozen earth, preparing to face relentless assaults. Despite shortages of fuel, ammunition, and manpower, their resolve stiffened with each passing day. What they lacked in numbers they made up for in grit and improvisation. In the forest around St. Vith, they would fight a battle that became legendary. For the Germans, St. Vith was a critical objective in their opening moves of Operation Wacht am Rhein. Panzer columns surged westward, led by the 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel. German armored divisions, including the elite 2nd Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr, aimed to seize the crossroads swiftly and push beyond it toward the Meuse. Yet the American defense stiffened their advance, forcing the Wehrmacht into costly, grinding assaults. Manteuffel's troops faced not just the defenders, but the clock itself, as delays threatened to unravel Hitler's grand strategy. The Germans committed heavy artillery, bombarding the town with shells that reduced houses to rubble and set entire streets ablaze. Infantry pressed forward through snow and smoke, while tanks tried to break through American lines along icy roads. But each attack was blunted, slowed, and repelled by fierce resistance. St. Vith became a choke point, sapping German strength day after day. The weather, already a curse for both sides, added to the misery of the fighting. Snowstorms blanketed the battlefield, reducing visibility to yards and grounding much of the Allied air power. Roads became sheets of ice, slowing tanks and trucks alike, while soldiers trudged through waist-deep drifts. Artillery shells landed with muffled explosions in the snow, sending frozen clumps of earth skyward. Soldiers on both sides endured frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion as they fought hour after hour in the bitter cold. The Americans dug foxholes that quickly filled with icy water, forcing them to stand in freezing mud. Weapons jammed, radios froze, and wounded men risked death from exposure as much as from bullets. Yet the snow also shielded movements, allowing small American units to slip into better positions or retreat without detection. The Ardennes forest seemed determined to test every ounce of human endurance. The battle for St. Vith was fought as much against nature as against the enemy. Inside St. Vith itself, the town became a shattered fortress. Buildings crumbled under bombardment, while streets filled with wrecked vehicles and debris. American soldiers fought from house to house, setting up machine guns in windows and sniper positions in attics. German troops stormed the outskirts repeatedly, only to be thrown back by disciplined volleys and counterattacks. Civilians who had not fled took shelter in basements, listening as the town above them disintegrated. Fires lit the night sky, casting eerie shadows on the snow-covered ruins. Tanks rumbled through narrow streets, their tracks grinding over rubble as they exchanged fire at point-blank range. The smell of smoke, cordite, and blood filled the air, choking those who fought within the town. To hold St. Vith, soldiers endured days of unrelenting combat, where every wall became a barricade and every street a battlefield. The town became a symbol of resistance, a fortress carved from desperation. General Clark's leadership was central to the American defense. Realizing that holding St. Vith indefinitely was impossible, he orchestrated a skillful delaying action designed to buy precious time. Using flexible defense-in-depth tactics, Clark repositioned units constantly, forcing the Germans to fight for every yard. His use of armored counterattacks struck at German flanks, blunting advances and sowing confusion. Clark inspired confidence among his men, moving from position to position in the snow to rally his forces. His ability to stretch meager resources into effective defenses earned him the admiration of both his soldiers and superiors. Clark's defense was not glamorous, but it was brilliant in its efficiency and stubbornness. While the Germans pressed forward with overwhelming firepower, they found themselves bogged down in a mire of resistance. Each hour gained at St. Vith threw Hitler's timetable further into disarray. In the end, time was the true victory of St. Vith. By December 23rd, the weight of German pressure and the encirclement threat forced the Americans to withdraw from St. Vith. The decision was not a defeat, but a calculated move to preserve forces for the larger battle ahead. The withdrawal was conducted under fire as units slipped through narrow corridors while German artillery pounded relentlessly. Many men wept as they left the town they had defended with such ferocity, but they knew their mission had succeeded. St. Vith had not fallen quickly, as Hitler had demanded. It had taken precious days and immense German resources. The stubborn defense disrupted the enemy's timetable and denied them the rapid breakthrough they needed. American forces pulled back to new positions, bloodied but unbroken, their stand etched into history. For the Germans, the delay was catastrophic, forcing them to abandon some of their objectives. The crossroads of St. Vith had bought the Allies time, and time was everything. The Battle of St. Vith remains one of the most remarkable stands of the Ardennes offensive. Though overshadowed by Bastogne in memory, the defense of St. Vith played a crucial role in stopping Hitler's gamble. It showed the resilience of American soldiers thrown into chaos, the importance of leadership under fire, and the power of determined resistance. The fortress in the forest did not hold forever, but it held long enough to change the course of the battle. Vith proved that even against overwhelming odds, a stubborn defense could fracture the plans of an entire army. The snow-covered ruins became a testament to endurance and sacrifice, remembered by those who fought and those who survived. In the larger tapestry of the Bulge, St. Vith was a thread that could not be overlooked. Without its defense, the German drive might have reached further faster, with dire consequences. The Ardennes offensive was slowed not only at Bastogne, but also at St. Vith, and in that slowing, victory was born. The Meuse River was the ultimate objective of Hitler's Ardennes gamble, the line that, if reached, could split the Allied front and open the road to Antwerp. To German planners, the fast-moving spearheads of panzers had to seize the bridges before the Allies could react. It was a race against time, against fuel shortages, and against the winter landscape that swallowed entire divisions in snow. As December wore on, the German columns pushed west, their armoured thrusts cutting deep into Belgium. Villages fell in rapid succession. American outposts were overrun, and panic spread along the rear lines. Refugees flooded the roads, mingling with retreating soldiers, as rumours swirled that the Germans were unstoppable. Yet the Meuse still lay miles ahead, its crossings guarded by hastily assembled Allied defenses. The tension grew with every passing day as Eisenhower's headquarters tracked each German advance with dread. The crisis at the Meuse was not a distant possibility, it was an imminent threat. The river became the fulcrum of the battle, the line that could decide the fate of the Western Front. At the heart of the German drive was the 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel. His divisions pushed relentlessly forward, leading the central thrust that aimed for Dennent and Namur. Alongside them, Sepp Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army sought to break through in the north, while the 7th Army shielded the southern flank. Yet fuel shortages plagued every column, forcing commanders to capture American depots or abandon tanks by the roadside. Panthers and Tigers, symbols of German armored might, sat frozen in snowbanks for want of gasoline. Still, when they advanced, their power was undeniable, overrunning towns with the weight of steel and fire. German soldiers spoke of the Meuse with hope and desperation, convinced that crossing it would change the war. Hitler himself demanded speed, furious at delays around Bastogne and St. Vith. To him, the Meuse was not just a river, it was the key to splitting the Allies in two. The fate of the offensive pressed toward its icy waters. For the Allies, the danger was real and immediate. Intelligence reports painted a picture of columns of panzers slicing through the Ardennes, driving ever closer to the river. Eisenhower and Montgomery recognized that if the Meuse crossings fell, the Germans could potentially reach Antwerp and sever the Allied supply lines. Bridges were prepared for demolition, with engineers wiring explosives and guards posted to prevent surprise attacks. British units under Montgomery shifted south to reinforce the line, while American reserves were rushed westward. The roads became clogged with trucks, tanks, and artillery, all converging on the river crossings in a desperate effort. Local civilians watched in awe and terror as entire armies moved through their villages, preparing for a showdown that could decide Europe's fate. The tension was palpable, every soldier knowing the importance of the ground they defended. It was no longer about holding a sector, it was about holding the line of history itself. The Allies understood that failure at the Meuse would be catastrophic. The German spearheads came closer than many dared to admit. At places like Cellars, only a few miles from the Meuse, panzers prowled within sight of the river's valley. Patrols reached the outskirts of key towns, their commanders peering across snowy ridges at the line they had been ordered to cross. Yet time was slipping away, and fuel shortages grew crippling. Crews siphoned gasoline from abandoned vehicles, while supply trucks failed to keep pace with the armored advance. American fighter bombers, once grounded by weather, now roared overhead as skies cleared, strafing convoys and torching fuel depots. German commanders watched in frustration as their momentum sputtered in the face of relentless Allied resistance. The Meuse, so close in miles, remained distant in reach. The drive that had begun with such fury was losing its strength. The river's icy waters stood as a barrier both physical and symbolic. On the ground, the fighting near the approaches to the Meuse was fierce and chaotic. Small American units dug in along ridges and crossroads, throwing up desperate roadblocks against advancing armor. At Cellars, armored elements of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division clashed with German panzers in a battle of steel and fire. The ground shook with a duel of Shermans and Panthers, shells screaming through snow-filled air. Infantry fought from hedgerows and forests, ambushing tanks with bazookas at point-blank range. Villages were reduced to rubble as artillery pounded relentlessly, each side determined to control the routes to the river. German troops fought with the desperation of men who knew this was their last chance to turn the tide of war. American defenders fought with equal ferocity, determined to deny the enemy any foothold across the Meuse. For hours, the battle teetered on a knife's edge. The river loomed just beyond, unseen but ever present in the minds of all who fought. Fuel shortages now crippled the German offensive more than any Allied bullet. Tanks ground to a halt, their engines silent in the snow, their crews shivering inside frozen steel. Some divisions abandoned vehicles altogether, marching west on foot as supply lines collapsed. Fuel dumps became more valuable than ammunition, fought over with desperation by both sides. German commanders cursed the delays, knowing every stalled tank meant the Meuse grew further out of reach. Allied air power only worsened the crisis, bombing convoys that struggled to bring supplies forward, roads choked with wreckage, burned out trucks, smouldering in the cold. For the men of the Wehrmacht, the offensive that had begun as a daring gamble now seemed like a slow strangulation. They could see the Meuse in their dreams, but they could not reach it in reality. The river remained a goal slipping through their grasp, like ice melting in the palm of a hand. Allied reinforcements continued to pour in, solidifying the defense of the Meuse. British units, including armored brigades under Montgomery's command, established strong defensive positions along the river. American divisions rushed from north and south to plug gaps, building a wall of men and steel. Engineers mined bridges. Artillery batteries were placed on high ground, and anti-tank guns covered every approach. What had begun as a patchwork defense became, in a matter of days, a formidable barrier. The German dream of crossing the Meuse began to fade, as reports filtered back of failed attempts and mounting losses. For Allied soldiers, the relief was palpable. They could feel the momentum shifting. What had once been a desperate scramble was becoming a line that could not be broken. The Meuse stood firm, defended by sheer will and growing power. The crisis was easing, though its shadow remained. By the end of December, the German offensive had failed to reach its ultimate prize. The Meuse, though threatened, remained untouched, its crossing secure in Allied hands. Hitler's gamble had come within sight of success, yet distance and resistance had conspired to deny him. The soldiers who fought near its banks remembered the fear of those days, when it seemed the Germans might break through. They also remembered the relief when the tide turned, when reinforcements held the line and the panzers faltered. The crisis at the Meuse was a turning point, the moment when the Ardennes gamble began to unravel. For the Germans, it was the symbol of ambition thwarted, of momentum lost forever. For the Allies, it was proof that even in the darkest hours, their strength could rally and hold. The river became more than a line on a map. It became the line of victory, and beyond it the road now led eastward, toward Germany itself. By late December, the German offensive that had erupted with such fury was beginning to lose its momentum. The spearheads that once surged toward the Meuse now faltered, their tanks crippled by fuel shortages, and their infantry exhausted by relentless fighting. Hitler's dream of splitting the Allied front was collapsing beneath the weight of attrition and resistance. For the Allies, the darkest days of panic and retreat were giving way to determination and renewed strength. Eisenhower and his commanders saw the moment had come to seize the initiative and strike back. Reinforcements that had been rushing from across France and Belgium were now in position, their divisions ready to counterattack. The tide of the battle, once flowing east to west, was about to turn with devastating force. Allied morale surged as soldiers sensed the shift, knowing the Germans could not sustain their drive much longer. What had begun as a desperate defense was transforming into an offensive campaign. The counterattack was about to begin, and with it the reversal of Germany's last great gamble. General Patton and his Third Army stood at the forefront of this shift, having already executed his audacious turn north to relieve Bastogne. Patton now prepared his divisions to drive against the German southern flank. His tanks, battle-hardened and aggressive, rolled forward through snow and mud, hunting panzers that had once stalked the Ardennes. Patton's leadership galvanized his men, instilling in them the belief that they were no longer just holding ground, but delivering the blows that would end the German offensive. Artillery roared across the frozen hills, softening enemy positions before the armor advanced. Infantry followed in grim determination, pushing village by village, clearing forests that had become nests of resistance. Every mile tightened the noose around German formations, still struggling to hold their tenuous gains. Patton's aggression contrasted sharply with the German exhaustion, and the battlefield itself reflected the imbalance. Where once the Wehrmacht had surged forward, now it was being shoved back, yard by bloody yard. The initiative belonged to the Allies again. In the north, British forces under Field Marshal Montgomery prepared their own counteroffensive. With German spearheads threatening the Meuse only days before, the British now took the lead in securing and strengthening the northern flank. Armoured brigades rolled into action, their Churchill and Cromwell tanks clanking over icy roads. Infantry pushed through battered towns, linking up with American units in a coordinated drive. Montgomery, cautious by nature, insisted on careful preparation, but his troops executed their advance with precision. The German 6th SS Panzer Army, which had begun the offensive with high hopes, now faced overwhelming firepower and dwindling resources. Luftwaffe support, once feared, had all but vanished under Allied air superiority. German soldiers fought bitterly but were steadily forced into retreat. The British advance ensured that the Meuse crossings were no longer under threat. The net around the German forces was beginning to close from both north and south. Allied air power returned with a vengeance once the skies cleared. Fighter bombers prowled the snowy roads, strafing convoys and torching fuel depots. P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons swooped low over columns of German armor, their rockets shattering tanks caught in the open. Bombers targeted supply lines and bridges, isolating units already struggling with shortages. German soldiers learned to dread the sound of engines overhead, for every movement in daylight risked annihilation from above. What weather had once concealed now became a trap, exposing them to the full weight of Allied air superiority. American and British pilots turned the Ardennes into a killing ground, where panzers burned black against the snow. The Luftwaffe attempted to intervene, but its presence was too weak, too scattered, too late. The balance of power in the skies was total, and it broke the back of German mobility. Air dominance ensured that the counterattack on the ground would advance unopposed from above. On the ground, the counterattack unfolded with relentless pressure. American divisions pushed into towns that had been devastated by the German advance, reclaiming streets littered with wreckage and frozen bodies. Infantry cleared houses one by one, bayonets fixed, grenades ready for the inevitable ambushes. Engineers rebuilt bridges under fire, clearing paths for tanks to continue their drive. Artillery pounded enemy strongpoints with unceasing barrages, reducing once defended positions to smoldering ruins. German units, trapped in villages and forests, fought stubbornly but found themselves surrounded and overwhelmed. The Ardennes was being retaken in blood, its frozen fields a witness to the clash of steel and will. Yet this time, the momentum belonged wholly to the Allies, who pressed forward with growing confidence. Each mile regained brought relief to towns that had endured weeks of terror. Civilians emerged from cellars to greet liberators with tears, even as smoke still rose from their ruined homes. The counterattack was more than strategy, it was liberation in motion. The Germans tried to regroup, but their command structure was unraveling. Hitler still demanded victory, issuing orders from Berlin that bore little relation to the reality on the ground. Field marshals and generals argued over withdrawals, their authority undermined by Hitler's refusal to concede defeat. Units that had once fought with precision now stumbled through the snow, their cohesion shattered by losses and chaos. Tanks abandoned for lack of fuel-clogged roads, while wounded men froze to death, awaiting evacuation. Ammunition ran short, leaving soldiers with rifles but no bullets, artillery with empty barrels. Some formations fought on with grim determination, refusing to surrender even as the odds became hopeless. Others melted away, scattered in the forests, survivors of divisions that no longer existed. The once proud Wehrmacht was bleeding itself dry in the Ardennes. The counterattack revealed not just weakness, but the unraveling of Germany's last great gamble. The Allies pressed their advantage with unrelenting coordination. Eisenhower directed the overall strategy, ensuring pressure was applied from multiple directions at once. Bradley and Montgomery, despite their differences, worked to close the salient, choking off the German Bulge. Patton's drive north, linked with American forces pushing south, cutting into the heart of the German offensive. Corps and divisions that had been scattered days earlier were now part of a unified, overwhelming counterstroke. The scale of Allied logistics, once strained, now turned into a weapon, supplying fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements at a rate the Germans could not match. Soldiers sensed the tide had turned irrevocably, their spirits lifted by the momentum of victory. What had begun as a desperate fight for survival had become an advance toward triumph. The Ardennes, once a symbol of fear, was now the stage for the collapse of Germany's ambition. The counterattack was not just successful, it was decisive. By the first week of January 1945, the German Bulge in the Ardennes was collapsing. The Meuse was secure, Bastogne had held, and Allied forces were driving the enemy back toward their starting lines. Hitler's last gamble in the West had failed, leaving his armies battered, depleted, and on the defensive. The counterattack not only restored the front, but also marked the beginning of Germany's final retreat on the Western Front. The soldiers who fought in the snow understood the significance, even if they could not yet see the war's end. They had endured panic, siege, massacre, and chaos, only to emerge stronger, pushing their enemy back in defeat. The Ardennes was littered with burned tanks, shattered villages, and frozen corpses, testimony to the scale of the struggle. Yet amid the ruins, the Allies marched forward, their confidence restored. The counterattack had broken the German offensive, and with it the last hope of Hitler's empire. By late December 1944, Bastogne had become the heart of the Battle of the Bulge. Encircled by German forces, defended by the 101st Airborne Division, and scattered elements of other units, the town symbolized both Allied defiance and desperate endurance. For days, paratroopers and tank destroyer crews had held the crossroads against overwhelming odds, their supplies dwindling and their wounded freezing in makeshift aid stations. The skies had cleared just enough for Allied airdrops to bring vital ammunition and medical kits, but food remained scarce and morale stretched thin. German artillery pounded relentlessly, collapsing houses and digging fresh craters into the snow-covered streets. Soldiers huddled in foxholes and cellars, praying for relief as Christmas approached. For the defenders, every hour of resistance felt like an eternity. Yet Bastogne had become more than a town. It was a fortress, a symbol of Allied willpower. Across the lines, German generals fumed that this stubborn pocket delayed their entire timetable. The fate of Bastogne was tied to the fate of the Ardennes offensive itself. Far to the south, General George S. Patton was already in motion. His Third Army had executed a dramatic pivot northward, wheeling entire corps across snowbound roads to strike at the German encirclement. Patton's maneuver was a logistical marvel, requiring convoys of tanks, trucks, and artillery to traverse icy terrain in record time. Engineers worked day and night to keep roads clear, while supply officers scrambled to feed and fuel the advancing columns. Soldiers marched through blizzards, their breath frosting against scarves, their boots caked in snow, driven onward by Patton's relentless urgency. The general himself drove his staff hard, issuing orders with characteristic bluntness. Bastogne must be relieved at all costs. For Patton, the task was not just operational, it was personal, a chance to prove the Third Army's speed and resolve. Every mile gained brought his men closer to the beleaguered 101st. The German grip on Bastogne was tightening, but Patton's columns were racing against time. The stage was set for one of the war's defining moments. Inside Bastogne, the defenders clung to survival. As the ring of steel closed in, German infantry probed the perimeter daily, launching attacks supported by tanks that rumbled through the snow. Foxholes froze solid, and wounded soldiers were laid out in basements without proper medical supplies. Chaplains prayed over the dying, as surgeons worked with bare hands in the cold, amputating limbs with minimal anesthesia. Civilians trapped in the town shared their cellars with paratroopers, their lives intertwined in the crucible of siege. Ammunition was rationed, forcing soldiers to count every bullet, while bazooka teams waited until tanks were almost on top of them before firing. Yet morale held firm, bolstered by General Anthony McAuliffe's now famous one-word reply to a German surrender demand. Nuts! That defiance became a rallying cry, a reminder that Bastogne would not yield. Every man in the garrison understood that relief must come soon, or not at all. The town's fate hung on Patton's advance. The German forces encircling Bastogne knew the crossroads were vital, and they threw everything they had at the defenders. Tanks of the Panzer Division attempted repeated assaults, their tracks grinding through the snow toward American lines. Infantry stormed the wooded ridges and farmhouses around the town, fighting savage battles at close range. The Germans hoped to crush Bastogne before Patton's relief could arrive, sealing the pocket permanently. But the paratroopers of the 101st fought like veterans, holding every sector with grim determination. Airborne officers moved from foxhole to foxhole, rallying men who had not slept in days. Machine guns rattled through the forests, while mortars thumped in steady rhythm, breaking up enemy attacks. Despite mounting casualties, the line never cracked. The Germans underestimated the defenders' resilience, and time was slipping away from them. Every failed attack only deepened their frustration. On December 26th, the Third Army's leading elements closed in on Bastogne. The spearhead of the relief effort was Combat Command Rhein of the 4th Armored Division, commanded by Colonel Creighton Abrams. Abrams' tanks pushed forward along icy roads, blasting through ambushes and skirmishes as they drove toward the encircled town. The fighting was fierce, with German anti-tank guns hidden in villages and woods, exacting a toll on the advancing Shermans. Infantry rode on the tanks, leaping off to clear houses and trenches under machine gun fire. Snow whipped across the battlefield as artillery thundered from both sides. Yet Abrams pressed on, his men determined to punch a hole in the German lines. Hours of brutal fighting culminated in a breakthrough, and by late afternoon the lead tanks rumbled into the southern outskirts of Bastogne. The ring had been broken. Relief had arrived. The moment Abrams' tanks reached Bastogne was electric. Paratroopers cheered as the Shermans rolled into town, their engines roaring and guns still smoking from the fight. Soldiers embraced in the snow, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the surge of triumph. Civilians wept as they realized the siege was finally broken. Patton's promise had been kept. The Third Army had reached Bastogne. Supplies began to flow in immediately, trucks following the tanks with desperately needed food, ammunition, and medicine. The wounded were evacuated under fire, carried out of basements and barns where they had clung to life. For the men of the 101st, the relief was not just physical, but emotional, a lifeline after days of isolation. The story of Bastogne had shifted from defiance to salvation. The crossroads town would live, and with it Allied hopes in the Ardennes. For the Germans, the relief of Bastogne was a devastating blow. Their timetable had already slipped. Their spearheads stalled short of the Meuse, and now their encirclement of the critical crossroads had collapsed. Hitler's gamble was unraveling with each passing day, his armies bleeding in the snow. German commanders tried to regroup, but their momentum was gone, their resources dwindling. Bastogne remained firmly in Allied hands, serving as a base for the counterattack that would soon drive the Germans back. The panzer divisions that had once surged westward were now on the defensive, battered by airstrikes and relentless ground assaults. The relief of Bastogne marked not only a tactical victory, but the symbolic turning point of the battle. It proved that the Allies could withstand Germany's last great blow. The fortress had held, and the tide was now flowing in one direction only. The Ardennes offensive was doomed. The relief of Bastogne became one of the most iconic moments of the Second World War. Soldiers who were there never forgot the sight of Abrams tanks entering the town, their arrival like a miracle in the snow. To the men of the 101st, who had endured hunger, cold, and bombardment, it was vindication of their sacrifice. To Patton and the Third Army, it was proof of their speed, their aggression, and their ability to change the course of a battle. For the Allies as a whole, Bastogne became a symbol of endurance and defiance, a rallying point in the final push toward victory. The name Bastogne would forever be etched into military history, alongside Thermopylae and Verdun, as a place where courage shaped destiny. It was not only a tactical success, but a moment that captured the spirit of the Allied war effort. In the snow-covered crossroads of Belgium, history turned, the fortress had endured, and victory was now inevitable. By January 1945, the mighty German thrust into the Ardennes had spent its fury. What had begun as a bold gamble with panzers racing westward was now collapsing under relentless Allied counteroffensives. The bulge on the map, once so menacing, began to contract day by day. German spearheads had been blunted, their tanks abandoned in snowdrifts, their fuel tanks empty, their morale eroded. Allied divisions, reinforced and resupplied, pressed forward with determination, clawing back ground that had been lost in December. The Ardennes, once filled with panic and chaos, now witnessed the slow but steady advance of armies in control. Eisenhower's headquarters mapped the shrinking salient with satisfaction, redrawing lines as American and British forces advanced. Every mile reclaimed was a mile closer to Germany, a mile closer to ending Hitler's last offensive. The Bulge, once a symbol of German resurgence, was becoming a pocket of defeat, and in its shrinking lay the story of the Reich's final decline. Patton's Third Army drove from the south, relentless in its push. His tanks thundered through villages that had once been the edge of the German advance, reclaiming them with fire and steel. Shermans rolled past wrecked panthers and tigers, their blackened hulls frozen into the snow. Infantry advanced cautiously, wary of ambushes from SS units, still clinging to forest edges. Artillery blasted ridgelines and crossroads, breaking up German counterattacks before they could gain momentum. Engineers rebuilt bridges under fire, keeping supply lines open for the relentless advance. The men of the Third Army knew they were no longer fighting for survival, but for victory. Bastogne, now firmly secure, became a springboard for further attacks. Each day, Patton's columns bit deeper into the German salient, squeezing it from the south, His aggressive drive cut into the heart of the Bulge, hastening its collapse. From the north, Montgomery coordinated British and American forces in a steady, deliberate counteroffensive. His troops, reinforced with fresh divisions, advanced methodically, clearing towns and forests as they moved southward. British armor and American infantry worked side by side, pressing against the 6th SS Panzer Army. The Germans fought stubbornly, but their strength was waning, their once proud divisions reduced to fragments. The Allies had learned from December's chaos, and now advanced with cohesion, ensuring flanks were secure and supply lines steady. The contrast was stark. Allied pressure grew stronger with every mile, while German resistance grew weaker with every day. The salient that had bulged so dangerously now began to shrink visibly, squeezed between north and south. Montgomery's careful planning, combined with Eisenhower's coordination, created an overwhelming pincer. German commanders could see the trap forming, but had no strength to escape it. The Bulge was closing, inexorably and fatally. The fighting within the shrinking pocket was savage. German units, ordered by Hitler to hold ground to the last man, resisted with ferocity. Small groups of SS troops ambushed advancing columns, snipers fired from ruined houses, and artillery batteries continued to shell Allied positions. Villages were reduced to rubble, fought over again in scenes of close-quarters carnage. Civilians who had survived December now found themselves in the middle of another round of destruction. American and British troops fought street by street, room by room, against defenders who knew retreat was forbidden. German casualties mounted as men were sacrificed in futile counterattacks, buying time that no longer mattered. For the Allies the battles were costly, but every skirmish brought them closer to sealing the pocket. The Ardennes winter remained brutal, with snow and ice compounding the misery. Yet the advance continued, steady and unrelenting. Air power once again dominated the battlefield, accelerating the collapse of the German salient. Allied fighter bombers ranged freely over the Ardennes, striking convoys, artillery positions, and retreating columns. P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons shredded what was left of German mobility, torching tanks and trucks caught in open ground. Bombers pounded bridges, ensuring no reinforcements or supplies could reach the pocket. German soldiers marched on foot through snow, abandoned by their machines, harried from above with merciless precision. The Luftwaffe attempted sporadic sorties, but its strength was broken, its aircraft too few and too vulnerable. In January skies, Allied dominance was absolute, and the battlefield below reflected it. Roads became graveyards of burned-out vehicles, testament to the futility of German persistence. The shrinking Bulge was not only pressed by infantry and armor, it was starved and battered from the skies. Air superiority turned retreat into rout. As the Bulge shrank, German commanders faced impossible choices. Hitler's refusal to authorize timely withdrawals had already doomed entire units. Divisions that might have been saved were instead ground down to shadows of their former strength. Fuel shortages left tanks immobile, artillery silent, and supply columns stranded in snow. Morale collapsed, with soldiers knowing their sacrifices could not alter the outcome. Still, some fought on with grim determination, holding villages until they were annihilated. Others surrendered in groups, their will to resist broken by hunger, exhaustion, and hopelessness. For commanders like Manteuffel and Dietrich, the offensive they had launched with optimism now dissolved into retreat. Reports to Berlin were filled with requests for reinforcements that would never come. The Bulge was shrinking not only on maps, but in the spirit of the German army itself. For the Allies, the closing of the Bulge was both a military and symbolic victory. Soldiers who had endured December's shock now advanced with confidence, pushing back an enemy once thought invincible. The Ardennes battlefield, once a scar of fear, was transformed into proof of resilience and strength. Units that had been shattered, regrouped and returned to the fight, their determination hardened by survival. Civilians greeted the returning Allied forces with tears and relief, though their villages lay in ruins. Engineers cleared mines, repaired roads, and restored communications as the front line stabilized. The sense among Allied soldiers was clear. The tide of war had turned irreversibly. The Bulge was not just shrinking, it was collapsing into failure. The Germans had gambled everything and lost. January 1945 marked the beginning of the end. By the end of the month, the Ardennes front had largely returned to its pre-offensive line. The Great Bulge on the map, once a symbol of German ambition, was gone. In its place lay wreckage, burned tanks, shattered villages, forests splintered by artillery, and fields littered with the dead. For the Allies, the victory was costly but decisive, proving their capacity to endure and counterattack under pressure. For the Germans it was catastrophic, draining their reserves of men, fuel and armor they could never replace. Hitler's last gamble in the West had not only failed, it had accelerated the collapse of his Reich. The Bulge had shrunk into nothing, leaving behind scars that would never fully heal. Soldiers who survived knew they had witnessed history's pivot in the snowbound forests of Belgium. From that moment forward, the road led east, through the Rhine, and into the heart of Germany. The Bulge was gone, and with it the last illusion of German victory. When the guns finally fell silent in late January 1945, the Ardennes was transformed into a landscape of desolation. Snow-covered fields were scarred with blackened wrecks of tanks, artillery pieces and vehicles abandoned in haste. Villages that had once been quiet hamlets were reduced to charred shells, their stone walls shattered by shell fire. The cost of the Battle of the Bulge was staggering, and it fell heavily on both sides. For the Germans this had been their last great throw of the dice, a desperate attempt to reverse the tide of war. For the Allies it was a brutal test of endurance, exposing weaknesses even in victory. The battlefield bore mute testimony to the ferocity of 6 weeks of combat, littered with frozen corpses and the twisted remnants of mechanized war. Soldiers picking through the wreckage understood instinctively that they had endured something historic. The Bulge on the map was gone, but the scars it left were carved deeply into memory. The Ardennes, once quiet and wooded, had become a graveyard of ambition. The human cost was appalling, with both sides suffering grievous casualties. The US Army recorded over 80,000 casualties, including dead, wounded, and missing in action. Entire divisions had been decimated, their ranks shattered in the frozen forests and villages of Belgium and Luxembourg. The Germans fared worse still, losing an estimated 100,000 men in the failed offensive. Many were killed in action, others captured as prisoners, and countless more simply disappeared into the white wastelands of retreat. The SS Panzer divisions that had spearheaded the assault were hollow shells by January's end, their manpower exhausted. For the Allies, replacements arrived quickly, but for the Reich, these losses were irreplaceable. The young soldiers of the Wehrmacht had been sacrificed in a gamble that drained the very lifeblood of Germany's army. Survivors on both sides carried the weight of trauma long after the snow melted. Numbers told only part of the story, the faces of the fallen told the rest. Armor losses were catastrophic, particularly for the Germans. Nearly 600 tanks and assault guns were destroyed, abandoned or captured during the battle. The mighty Tiger Tis, which had terrified Allied tankers at first, now lay broken in forests and villages, their hulks burned and gutted. Shermans, Stuarts, and half-tracks were scattered across roadsides, mute testimony to the relentless clash of steel. The German panzer divisions, once the cutting edge of Hitler's military, could no longer be rebuilt to their former strength. The Allies, with their industrial might, replaced losses within weeks, filling divisions with new machines from American factories. For Germany, there were no reserves of steel, oil, or men to replenish the wreckage left in the Ardennes. The collapse of armor strength marked the end of German offensive capability in the West. From now on, their panzer divisions would fight defensively without hope of seizing the initiative again. The graveyards of tanks in the Ardennes foreshadowed the fate of the Reich itself. Fuel shortages haunted German columns throughout the offensive, and their consequences became undeniable in the aftermath. Thousands of vehicles had been abandoned, their tanks dry, their crews forced to flee on foot. Roads were lined with silent convoys, from trucks to prime movers, all rendered useless by empty fuel drums. The Wehrmacht's logistical gamble had failed, and the price was evident in the frozen wrecks strewn across Belgium. Allied soldiers marveled at the sight of Tiger tanks, left intact simply because they could no longer move. Hitler's obsession with striking west had squandered what remained of Germany's strategic fuel reserves. By February, the Reich's armored forces were shadows, crippled by shortages that no miracle could fix. The Ardennes gamble had drained resources that might have prolonged resistance. Instead, they were lost in snow and fire, hastening the collapse of German might. Fuel, or the lack of it, had sealed the fate of the last German offensive. The suffering of civilians was immense, with thousands of Belgian and Luxembourgish families caught in the storm. Villages like Hoffelais, La Roche, and Malmedy lay in ruins, their homes destroyed by artillery or airstrikes. Families who had endured the German occupation now endured bombardment and fire as armies clashed in their streets. Many were killed in the fighting, others displaced in the depths of winter, forced to seek shelter in barns and cellars. Food shortages gripped entire regions, and hunger compounded the misery of freezing nights. Civilians watched helplessly as their towns became battlegrounds, their lives shattered by forces beyond their control. Allied troops shared rations with starving villagers, though supplies were scarce even for soldiers. The cost of liberation was heavy, leaving a trail of grief that lingered long after the snow melted. The Ardennes would not only be remembered as a soldier's battle, but as a civilian tragedy. War spared no one, not even the innocent. For the Allies, victory came at a steep price but carried undeniable lessons. American commanders recognized the need for tighter intelligence coordination after being caught off guard. Units that had been considered untested or poorly equipped now proved their resilience under pressure. The 101st Airborne stand at Bastogne, the stubborn defense of St. Vith, and countless small unit actions showed the depth of American determination. British forces, too, played their role, sealing the northern shoulder of the Bulge and preventing German breakthroughs. The cooperation of Allied armies, once strained by egos and disagreements, grew stronger in the aftermath. Eisenhower's leadership matured, his ability to hold the coalition together tested and proven. Soldiers in the field learned that victory came not only through firepower, but through endurance and sacrifice. The Ardennes had been both a shock and a crucible, forging an army stronger than before. Its cost was measured in blood, but its legacy was resilience. For Germany, the defeat at the Bulge was final confirmation of strategic bankruptcy. Hitler had gambled everything on a blow that his generals doubted from the start. His refusal to permit withdrawals, his fantasy of splitting the Allies, and his faith in armored thrusts had drained the Reich. Experienced commanders like Manteuffel and Rundstedt knew the offensive was doomed, but their protests were ignored. The destruction of elite panzer units left the Wehrmacht crippled, unable to resist the coming Allied invasion of Germany. The Reich's last reserves of armor, fuel, and manpower had been squandered in 6 weeks of futility. Soldiers returned to the fatherland, not as victors but as shattered remnants. Civilians in Germany began to understand that the war was lost, no matter what propaganda promised. The Ardennes had exposed the hollow shell of German power. Defeat was not only inevitable, it was now accelerating. The Battle of the Bulge ended as both tragedy and triumph. For the Allies, it was a costly but decisive victory that demonstrated their ability to recover from shock and deliver crushing counterblows. For Germany, it was the last great gamble of the Reich, a desperate bid that ended in ruin. The snow of the Ardennes covered not only the bodies of soldiers, but the last illusions of German victory. The casualties, the wrecked tanks, and the wasted fuel told the story more clearly than any speech or map. Hitler's gamble had failed, and the path to Berlin was now open. Soldiers who survived the Ardennes would march eastward in the spring, through the Siegfried Line, across the Rhine, and into the heart of Germany. The Ardennes would forever stand as the moment when the Reich's end became unmistakable. It was the aftershock of a lost gamble, the ruin of a nation's last hope. The Bulge was gone, but its cost would echo for generations. The Battle of the Bulge stands as one of the most iconic clashes of the Second World War. It was the largest battle ever fought by the US Army, testing American soldiers in conditions as brutal as any in modern history. For 6 weeks, young infantrymen, tank crews, and paratroopers endured snow, ice, hunger, and constant attack. Their endurance in the Ardennes became a symbol of determination, a reminder that even in chaos resolve could not be broken. German ambitions of splitting the Allied front had dissolved into a nightmare of attrition and loss. For the Allies, the battle's legacy was not only victory, but proof of their capacity to recover from shock. The snowbound forests of Belgium became etched into memory as a proving ground of American resilience. For the Germans, it was remembered as the last desperate gamble of a Reich in terminal decline. History records the Ardennes not only in numbers and maps, but in the human cost it demanded. Its legacy remains one of courage, tragedy, and inevitability. For American veterans, the Ardennes became a defining moment of their service. Units like the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, the Defenders of St. Fer, and countless infantry regiments found themselves immortalized by their stand. Survivors spoke of freezing nights in foxholes, of sharing meager rations, and of comrades who did not live to see spring. The resilience of ordinary soldiers transformed into legend, shaping the identity of the post-war US Army. In towns across America, the memory of the Bulge was carried in family stories and reunion halls. Veterans associations ensured the sacrifices of the Ardennes were not forgotten. The battle became a source of national pride, evidence that citizen soldiers could endure the harshest test of war. Medals and honors were awarded, but the true legacy lived in memory, far beyond citations. For many who fought, the Ardennes became the single most searing chapter of their lives. It was not just a battle but a crucible of endurance. For Germany, the legacy of the Bulge was far darker. Hitler's gamble destroyed his last armored reserves, leaving the Wehrmacht fatally weakened. Panzer divisions that had once struck fear into Europe were reduced to fragments that could never be rebuilt. Survivors carried with them the knowledge that their sacrifices had been in vain. German officers later reflected that the offensive had been doomed from the start, a fantasy detached from reality. The loss marked the beginning of the final collapse of the Reich, setting the stage for invasion and defeat. In post-war memory, the Ardennes became a symbol of Hitler's obsession and strategic blindness. It revealed the cost of dictatorship, where ideology outweighed reason and loyalty outweighed logic. The German army would never again launch a major offensive in the West. Its legacy was futility, written in snow and fire. For the people of Belgium and Luxembourg, the legacy was written into their villages and fields. Entire communities had been erased in weeks, their homes destroyed by artillery and bombing. Families carried memories of hiding in cellars, of seeing their homes shattered, of watching tanks roll through their streets. Survivors told of American soldiers who shared food, of German troops who commandeered everything they had. Monuments rose in towns like Bastogne and Malmedy, reminders of suffering but also of liberation. The Ardennes remained scarred long after the war, forests replanted and ruins rebuilt, but memories never erased. Civilian stories became part of the larger narrative of the Bulge, proof that wars do not spare the innocent. Generations grew up hearing of the battle from grandparents who lived through the winter of 1944. For them, the Ardennes was not just history, it was lived memory. Their legacy was survival, carried forward in remembrance. Strategically, the Bulge became a textbook case of failure and recovery. For Allied commanders, it demonstrated the dangers of complacency and the need for constant vigilance. Intelligence lapses, underestimation of the enemy, and overconfidence nearly produced disaster. Yet the recovery showed the strength of coalition warfare, with British, American, and eventually Soviet strategy aligning against Germany. For students of military history, the Bulge highlighted the importance of logistics, fuel, and weather. It revealed how terrain could shape battle, how forests and rivers could become both obstacle and refuge. The Ardennes entered military academies as a case study in leadership under crisis. Eisenhower, Patton, and Montgomery all emerged with their reputations tested, reshaped, and in some cases enhanced. German generals would later dissect the offensive as an example of reckless ambition. Its legacy remains a masterclass in both the risks of overreach and the power of resilience. In popular memory, the Ardennes has been immortalized in books, films, and documentaries. From war memoirs to Hollywood dramas, the snowbound forests became an enduring stage of heroism and tragedy. Bastogne, in particular, captured the public imagination, with its tale of defiance against impossible odds. The famous reply of General McAuliffe, "Nuts," became shorthand for American grit. The Malmedy Massacre became equally infamous, a chilling reminder of war's brutality. Through these stories, the Bulge was fixed in cultural memory not only as a battle, but as a symbol. It was remembered as much in human anecdotes as in military analysis. Families passed down stories of fathers, brothers, and uncles who froze in foxholes or fought in ruined towns. The Ardennes became a touchstone for courage under fire, retold for generations. Its legacy lived not only in strategy, but in storytelling. Internationally, the battle underscored the strength of Allied cooperation. American manpower, British experience, and shared sacrifice fused into a victory that proved the coalition's durability. Stalin recognized the significance, though he never forgot his demand for a second front. Churchill praised the Americans for their resilience, while Roosevelt drew strength from the victory to rally his nation. In post-war Europe, the Ardennes became part of the shared Allied identity, proof of unity in adversity. Yet it also revealed tensions, as British and American leaders debated credit and responsibility. Still, the ultimate outcome was undeniable. The Allies had withstood the last German storm. The legacy of unity endured, even as the Cold War later divided old partners. The Ardennes was remembered as the moment when cooperation carried the day. Its memory reinforced the belief that collective resolve could overcome even the fiercest blow. The Battle of the Bulge endures as the last great drama of Hitler's war in the West. It was a story of desperation, endurance, and the winter that tested them all for Germany. It marked the final squandered chance, the draining of reserves that sealed their fate. For the Allies, it was proof that even surprise and shock could not break their advance toward victory. For civilians, it was a tragedy endured, a winter of terror never forgotten. The Ardennes forests still hold remnants of that battle, foxholes, monuments, and graves scattered among the trees. Veterans who returned in later years wept at those sites, remembering comrades who had not. Historians continue to study its lessons, military and human, ensuring the battle's place in memory. The Ardennes was not just a bulge on a map, but a crucible of history. Its legacy is eternal, echoing through the silence of snow-covered forests.